All right, and we are recording. This is round two of Pox Populi and Travanti. Part one of our discussion will be linked in the description. In the second part, we are going to be talking about some of the topics that we left off on. So in part one, we talked about Western civilization and what does that mean to both of us, both in history and present day. And we got into lots of other things as well. Um, in this round, in this part, we're going to be talking about racial differences, the ideological state versus the nation state, and things like that. But we did get some feedback from part one of people wanting to know a little bit more about ourselves. I did, I think I did ask you to give us a little bit of your backstory, but if you feel like there's some more details about your backstory that you want to divulge, let's go ahead and start with that. So over to you, Travanti.
Certainly. So, my backstory. I am a millennial, and so as you know, millennials are the generation who were sold the American dream, and then we go to college. We're told that if we get a university degree, that the whole world is going to open up for us, only to have a housing collapse around 2008, 2007. It was right when Bush was ceding authority to Obama. So Obama inherited a really poor economy. And so clearly there were signs that we were changing. America was not going to be the same. Everything was changing. Grew up religious, grew up a Christian, um, went through a period of atheism when I saw how polarized and divided the church was. I went to multiple universities, but one of them was a Christian college. And I noticed that the liberal Christians were, in terms of how they presented the gospel or interpreted it, they seemed very shallow to me. They were indistinguishable from the secular realm. And then the conservative Christians, there was a little bit more meat on the bone in terms of their uh, gospel, their version of the gospel, but it was very judgmental. It was lacking in love. It was very exclusionary. And I'll never forget, I was invited to an off campus Bible study once. And I guess I asked too many questions because they told me in no uncertain terms that I was not welcome back. And so it was, even though it was hurtful, it was not something that I was unfamiliar with because I've always had antipathy towards, I get not authority in and of itself, but arbitrary authority, people who just say this is the way it is. And that was an issue that I struggled with in college when I was getting my bachelor's degree in philosophy. I had one professor tell me, Travanti, if you really feel this way, you should just drop out of college. And I was like, wow. Of course I didn't. I ended up getting a bachelor's, which I earned with distinction. Later on, I would I would go to graduate school again, but when I realized that graduate education in the humanities and specifically in philosophy had devolved into an industry, and that it was about tenure track positions, and it wasn't about philosophizing. It wasn't about what I saw Socrates doing, which was standing up to the establishment. It wasn't um, it wasn't what Nietzsche was doing. It wasn't what I mean, the list could go on and on and on of people who challenged the prevailing presuppositions of their time. It wasn't untimely, it was very timely because there was an economic advantage at stake. And so I took a long leave of absence. I went home, and I was this was during my period of atheism. Went home, had a mystical conversion, uh, you know, had an experience where I started believing in the God of the Bible again, had received what I thought was a vision of a new kind of world, a world not divided by, and when I say vision, I mean a literal vision. Like I went to sleep at night and I had this vision of like a new way of being in the world where people were not divided by nationality and race and socioeconomic status, but everybody was sort of knit together like a garment. And I woke up a completely changed person. I thought, that is what I want. And after that period, I began to see the world in stark contrasts. For me, light was anything that brought people together and that was rooted in interpersonal connections. And darkness was anything that divided us. So, for example, if you look at the current conflict, which apparently Trump thinks he solved, in the Middle East between Gaza and the nation and Israel, to me, that whole situation is clouded in darkness. There's no clear uh, heroes and villains because everywhere I look, I see people fighting over territory. When I look at the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, it's the exact same thing. What Russia did was wrong, but it's a murky situation because I see darkness everywhere, and even here in the United States. And so everything that I do centers upon my desire to spread light, which means bringing people together and not dividing them along what I think are arbitrary um, identities. So later on, I would go back, get a master's degree in humanities, realized how much the academy had changed. Is it true that a kind of toxic feminism has taken over the arts and letters and a lot of universities? Yes, it's true. I encountered it. And what I mean by that is this. When I think of feminism, I think of like classical feminism. So the right to vote, the right to break glass ceilings if you want to pursue a career in corporate America, the right to control your reproductive organs, own homes, and things. All of that I'm fine with. But what's emerged out of that as of late is a kind of misandry, a hatred of men, and an attempt to try to put men in their place. And it's pushed a lot of men out of the humanities and into the dissident right. And I think they're trying to study, they want to study literature, they want to study philosophy in a place where they feel welcomed and safe. And I agree with that. The problem is a lot of these people didn't finish their degrees. And so they didn't undergo the kind of intellectual cultivation that makes these kinds of conversations productive. I pushed through, I refused to be chased out of the academy, and I wound up being able to go to the University of Leeds in England and work on getting a PhD in classics. I've always been drawn to the ancient world. And so I haven't abandoned the academy, but I recognize that there are problems.
Okay, that's obviously a very profound and fascinating backstory. I won't go into too much detail about mine. I think people who have followed this channel for the time that it's been active and all my other platforms have heard me ramble on about it before. But it's interesting that you talk about this vision that you had, because it's been said so many times now that it's almost a cliche that modern liberalism and this globalism project that's sort of like an offshoot of it is like a new religion, in that it inspires almost like a holy quest. It has saints, it has martyrs, it has sins, it has definite sins that you shall not commit. It seems to have like a priestly caste. So that was an interesting way to describe how you had this sort of change of mind, or not a change of mind, but like an inspirational vision, almost in a religious sense. So maybe there is some truth to that claim that, you know, as we became a less religious society, politics basically took the place of religion. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I think that people who have become skeptics of faith-based claims, yes, politics has become their new religion. But obviously, politics can never truly replace religion. Um, because number one, religion is rooted in faith. And if you're coming from a place of skepticism, you can't really believe in something. You're going to be constantly requiring tests and proofs that something is real, rather than just saying, I accept this and I'm going to go forward believing it no matter what obstacles I encounter. Also, a lot of modern liberal ideas were first asseverated by Christians. So the social justice comes from the social gospel, the belief that churches should try to do something to ameliorate the sufferings of the poor. The civil black people had been agitating for change in America for a long time, but it was the churches during the civil rights era, Martin Luther King being the de facto leader, who banded together and forced change. And so Christianity has been the backbone of modern liberalism from the beginning.
Yeah, I think there'll be some people perhaps in my audience that will bristle at that, but I think you're right. And longtime followers of my work will know that my position on Christianity is a complicated one, kind of like yours. But I arrived at a different final destination. And I do see Christianity as, and we talked about this in part one as well, and I see it as also one of the earliest phenomena of globalizing the world, and this integrated society where people can unite under something else besides their tribal identity, their ethnos, their nation, to use either term, which up until rather recently meant the same thing, just in different languages, Greek and Latin. But yes, I do believe that there are many similarities between the liberal ethos and the Christian ethos. And then, of course, even beyond that, I think it was Carl Schmitt who said that Christianity is the grandmother of Bolshevism, even. So, I mean, it gets pretty interesting. So you mentioned something, and I think it's a good place to kick off this second round. You mentioned that for you, the light is bringing people together. Now, I know that you wanted to challenge me, so I'll let you have the opportunity. But I guess as host, I kind of have to guide the conversation. So I have to challenge you first. Why is bringing people together good when we know throughout history that if people, especially if they don't want to be brought together, different people getting into closer and closer proximity often leads to conflict. So are you not rolling the dice? Or are you saying that the conflicts will be overcome and it will be worth the cost of whatever those conflicts have to get to, I don't know, like, I don't want to say a utopia, but a better place? Like, okay, so just like the creation of the nation states that I admire, that I like, involved conflicts. When the conflicts were resolved, well, we had a nation state, and some eggs had to be broken, but the omelet was made, and it's a pretty good omelet, at least from my perspective. So yeah, that's the question, is why is bringing people, different people especially, together the light for you? Why is that good?
Because, I mean, even what you just said about you like the nation state, well, the nation state emerged out of conflict. It was something that people like Napoleon, and even prior to Napoleon, Louis XIV, began constructing in order to unity. How would I say it? In order to increase the strength of the people. So the people are stronger when they're united as opposed to when they're divided. And Louis XIV in France, he inherited a divided kingdom. Power was kind of parceled out amongst various feudal lords, and that's why he built Versailles. He builds Versailles, and then he invites all of the nobles into the kingdom to come live with him. And while they're partying with him in Versailles, he's able to increase the power of the monarchy, which opens the door for the consolidation of power by a federal system, aka the Napoleonic government after the revolution. And so the nation state comes at the expense of fragmentation that existed prior to that, but also because out of people working together and coming together, everything that we take for granted in our modern culture came into being. As long as human beings were divided, they lived in a state of uh, primitive. Uh, they lived in a primitive condition. I'll just put it that way. But once they began exchanging ideas with each other and communicating with each other, that was when civilization came into being. The other thing is, I think coming together is a recognition of our common humanity. And I think a lot of the grounds for separating involves what I call objectification, objectifying people, dehumanizing people, treating people like they don't share your common humanity. And it makes it easy to commit heinous crimes against humanity. But when you are, to my view, subjectivizing them, meaning imbuing them with the same qualities that you possess, it's harder to commit those same evil acts. And so when you're talking about the development of culture and civilization, I think coming together is better. When it comes to having the collective might to resist uh, authoritarian entities, whether it's a government or an NGO, whatever it is, the might of the collective is stronger than these would be authoritarian entities. And honestly, like I said, I had that vision and I just believe in sort of a kingdom of love. And also, if you look at the rise of Christendom brought together a whole bunch of feuding, warring European tribes. They were fighting with each other nonstop. After the collapse of Rome, before the High Middle Ages, there was nonstop fighting amongst European tribes. And the church began saying, okay, because now you're becoming Christians, you can't fight on this day. And that's severely limited the amount of violence that was taking place in Europe.
Okay, I'll what I'll do this time is I'll just respond to some things, and then that'll kind of give my position, and you can come back with some challenges of your own. So my response to what you're saying is, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that I buy it. So first of all, I'm not so sure that people can't create civilization on their own. I'm not so sure that they require intermingling or interacting or exchanging ideas and I don't know, technological advances or tools and whatnot. I think, especially when you get to the primordial state of a people, the culture they create and the civilization they create, and also civilization is such a like we discussed in part one. It is such a vague term sometimes. Oftentimes, I feel like when people say civilization, what they're really talking about is technology. Did these people have tech? So whether it's ancient history and we're looking at people who had uh, a written language, two-story buildings, metallurgy, okay, that's a civilization. And in any event, culture basically is also another vague term, but to me it just means you have language, you have a religion, you have some form of organizing society, you have some artistic expression, which means that people have free time, that they can be able to do that, which means that if they have free time, they must have some sort of technological advances that allow them to have free time, and they must have some sort of surplus of calories that allow them to be well fed and able to do things like create art. And I think that people create that organically on their own. I don't think they need interacting with other people. Therefore, people often say like, race is just a social construct. But I think that actually race is a biological construct, and the culture is the social construct that comes downstream from a people's biology. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that just like in the animal kingdom, where a people is located and where they evolve, whether it's a people who is in a high altitude location versus a people in a forest, or people living in more of a desert location, or the peoples of the steppe, their cultures, the things that they evolve around, that the environment that they adapt to, will define the culture or the civilization that they over time develop. And then if they expand, whoa, there's my dog. And then if they, when these peoples expand, the populations get bigger. I don't believe in the idea that ancient peoples were closed off, that there was no interaction amongst peoples in different land masses or different parts of the continents. I think people in the ancient times actually did have quite a lot of contact with each other. And did move around a bit, and whether it's through trade routes and the mercantile class that's traveling around, or whether it's sailing, crossing the seas on ships, whether it's the Vikings and things like that. So of course, societies, they get bigger, they get more populous. People are adventurous; they want to see what's beyond the horizon. And but I think it'd be fascinating. I always think if I could go in a time machine, I'd love to just be there the moment that two completely different people come into contact for the first time. That's something we'll never experience. What's that like? The first time a Norseman came in contact with a North American Indian, that just seems so, I don't know, there's just something really fascinating and intriguing about that, because it's something we'll never experience. So that's one thing that I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on. Now, another thing is that when we talk about bringing people together, okay, who's doing the bringing and who are the people we're talking about? Because it's one thing to say, we're going to bring together the Italic peoples of the Italian peninsula, and we're going to, despite all the different dialects we speak, and despite all this history of being ruled by the French and the Spaniards, we're going to find common ground on some things, our ancestral roots, kick out the French, kick out the Austrians, kick out the Spaniards, and have our own nation state called Italy, and then we'll figure out what the language is going to be later. Okay, you can kind of bring those people together because they have some things in common. But when we start talking about bringing, for example, in these European cities where now the European population, whether it's the German population of Berlin, the English population of Birmingham or London, the Spanish population of Madrid, they're all the minority now. Okay, so we're bringing together people from all over the world. And I'm not sure I trust the people who are doing it. And I'm not sure that all these people from Africa, from Pakistan, from India, from China, from Venezuela, from even other parts of Europe can be all brought together into this 100% unadulterated, unalloyed good of a society. I'm just not sold, because I see every day the problems that it's causing. I see every day the negative effects of it. And then just as far as like heinous crimes or violence and conflict, Christianity has a pretty bloody history, though. You mentioned the warring tribes that Christianity brought together. Well, that occasionally was done not very kindly. Charlemagne killed in one go thousands of Frankish pagan chieftains who didn't want to convert. So Christianity imposed itself just as the nation states that you don't quite like. And it broke a few eggs too, in order to get people to fall in line with this new religion that we're going to abide by. And then in present day, like I said in part one, globalism sometimes smacks of imperialism, and imperialism by nature involves conflict. And I do see that globalism, the way it kind of wants to consume all and to my mind, put us all under the same conditions. It's egalitarian. It's one of the impulses, one of the goals is an egalitarian society. You mentioned it yourself, people not being judged by their socioeconomic status, not being judged by their ethnic background. So it's an egalitarian society. And in order to achieve that, sometimes a heavy hand is required. And then even if there wasn't a heavy hand, there have just been, again, so many heinous crimes caused by this project as a side effect of this project. There are people who would be alive today but are not because they were killed by ideologues or, in some cases, I'm not even sure how much of it's ideological. I think a lot of it is actually, a lot of the motivation is actually capital. It's the capitalist class that's most enjoying and perhaps even pushing these open borders and mass migration and huge population increases through migration, because it's good for driving down the cost of labor, which is what the capital class always wants to do. But by bringing in people from third world societies, people in first world societies in Europe have been raped, they've been murdered, children have not had a chance to grow up because some Malian migrant who should have never been anywhere near that child was brought to Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Italy, and killed that child in some, moment of madness that we would think is madness. But then you listen to what these migrants say, and they say things like, I just had to. I had to do it. I had to rape that kid because it was a sexual emergency. I hadn't had sex in a few weeks or something. And then you find out that back where they're from in Africa, that is what they do. I'm always amazed at the story that came out of Finland when some Finnish NGO members had to explain to their Somali migrant pets that they had brought over that here, if a woman smiles at you, that doesn't mean you can rape her, because back where they were from, that's what they did. And then, of course, people in my audience might know of the documentary. There's this bald English actor who went to Africa, and he sort of embedded himself with some hard guys in Africa and in rural Africa. And they were explaining to him that, like, when they commit rape, and yeah, we rape, and he asked them, but how do you think that woman feels? And they just couldn't even fathom the question. They couldn't even understand, like, what do you mean? They had no capacity. And so if you bring a lot of people like that into a society where empathy and the golden rule and all that is really important, like, you're going to have heinous crimes. You're going to have lots of conflict, lots of problems. So I'm not sure that I buy the idea that this is actually going swimmingly. So I'm sure that you'll have some pushback on some of my claims there. So I'll throw it over to you.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. And I really appreciate your candor, because it's such a touchy subject, and it's hard to get anywhere when people don't feel heard. And both the sides that you and I represent oftentimes are talking at each other and not to each other. So having a completely forthright conversation about this topic is so important. So I want to start with one of your first claims. You said you're not sure that people can't create civilization on their own. And I'm going to say you're absolutely right to ask the following question, the subsequent question you asked, which is, what is civilization? What you described was not civilization in my point of view, that's society. So you talked about metallurgy and things like that. You can have a pre-civilizational society that has metallurgy. It existed in, there are parts of Africa where they have metallurgy and things of that nature. And I wouldn't call them a civilization. A civilization has to do with a level of complexity that goes beyond a very primitive society. So there's law, and there's philosophy, and there's a division of labor that is variegated. There's typically a bureaucracy. There are texts, and there are there's my goodness, there's like irrigation. There's so many different things that separate a society from a civilization. And part of the reason why I was arguing that contact between different societies is important for civilization is because if you look at secluded African cultures that have had almost no contact with anything else, and you look at those pre-Christian, pre-Romanized European cultures, they are practically the same, even in terms of their social structure. And I'll give you an example. If you look at the early Celts did not have writing because the Druids were saying you shouldn't write anything down. Keep it to yourself. There is a text that I hope that all of your listeners and you yourself will read. It's called Sunjata, the Epic of Mali. And it's told from the perspective of a griot. In Malinke, he'd be called a Jili. And the griots were to African culture what the Druids were to Celtic culture. They both believed that memory is best preserved through stories. So they would memorize a whole bunch of data about chronologies and genealogies and hierarchies and how this is done, and they basically became a living text to their the ruling class. And it's so funny when you read that text. I don't know why he agreed to retell the story of Sunjata, who was a Malinke king, to the person, the anthropologist who took the story down, but he violates that rule. And he gives arguments for why the griots typically would not do that. Plato says similar things. The difference is Plato actually wrote his stuff down.
I was going to say, Plato also recommended or was warning about too much literacy for those precise reasons, that it would erode the memory.
Yeah, mm-hmm. But he thankfully for us, he ends up doing it anyway.
Yeah.
There's a codified legal system that you have in civilization, and so there's definitely a big difference. But the changes that take place between societies that have very little to no contact with outside peoples and societies that do are enormous. One of the things that I kept noticing being brought up in the chat when the last video we did was they were saying Africa didn't have any wheels prior to contact with Europeans. That's totally not true. The Empire of Nubia and the Empire of or Nubia Kush, they had wheels. They had like wheeled carrot vehicles, and the Egyptians had chariots. Why? Because they were in contact with the Near Eastern cultures where that stuff was created. Some of the sub-Saharan African cultures had wheels too, but they didn't use it for transport because the topography was not suitable for chariot-based transportation. But if they were talking about pottery, stuff like that, they had wheels for that. But there were three major empires that emerged in sub-Saharan Africa: the Empire of Ghana, the Empire of Mali, and the Empire of Sanjai. They came about because Moorish merchants and Arab merchants needed intermediaries to help them transport goods that were very difficult to move across the desert. And that's where the Ghanaians came in, the Mandingos came in, who had their own kingdom, and the people of Sanjai. And they would trade salt and gold. And what happened in their society as a result of being into contact with these different cultures, which were in contact with Europe, was enormous. They built huge, extremely wealthy kingdoms. One of them actually founded the University of Timbuktu. So these
And
societies,
some of them even use slaves.
yeah, well, they trade,
Right?
yeah,
Like in Mali, that people often say that Mali was a very wealthy empire and had all this gold. And I always say, well, how did they extract that gold? What's the name of the great Malayan leader?
Mansa
Masa,
Musa.
yeah, Masa Musa. Well, they use slaves, So just like everyone else in the world, they conquered other people and they put them to work as slaves.
Yes, absolutely. And so, but those empires emerged out of basically forcing various local tribes underneath one banner. The Malinke were several different peoples. In fact, the story of Sunjata actually talks about how all of these various tribes united underneath his leadership. So there's that. Now, you asked, you're not sure if race is a biological construct. Like I said, you had barbarism happening in some parts of Africa, not everywhere, but some parts. You also have barbarism happening in Europe. I know you were kind of dubious about whether or not the sources we have for what was happening in pre-Christian Europe are trustworthy, but archaeology backs it up. If you look in Ireland, you have what was it called, the Lindo man and the Tallinn man. And these are bodies that show traces of ritualized murder and torture. Like these people were tortured before they were killed. They didn't do anything. They were just murdered to offer a human sacrifice. And then you'd mentioned the Brehon laws. There is some scholarship that suggests, well, first of all, we don't have any literary evidence of Brehon law until several centuries after the Christianization of Ireland, because Patrick shows up in the 5th century, I believe, and the Brehon laws were written down in the 7th and 8th centuries. So people have noted parallels between canon law and biblical law and what these Brehons were doing. And so what people are thinking is that already there is influence of Christianity there, and it has a progressive impact upon Irish culture. And so, again, bringing people together from different cultures, different societies, has a net positive impact. One thing before I get to the question of who is bringing people together, I want to mention this because you'd mentioned Christianity's history of violence. What we don't want to do is look at Christianity from the prism of one specific period. If you're talking about the early church, Christianity does not have a history of violence. Christianity was a religion of peace. If anything, the violence was being done to them, and they turned the other cheek, and that won them converts through a peaceful way. What happens is when they start getting converts from these pre-Christian European cultures, the Franks, the Gauls, the Celts, and things of that nature, those people bring their culture into the church, and it begins to replace the peaceful form of Christianity that had existed prior to that, when it was still mostly Mediterranean and mostly West Asian. So, for example, in Charlemagne's mind, I mean, was he a Christian? Sure. Was he converted in the sense that St. Anthony was? Probably not. In his mind, the conqueror forces his religion on other people. So that was a part of Frankish culture. That wasn't the church. One of the things that the church would do during the Inquisition, it would not itself exact any punishments on you. What they would do is they would release you to the authority of the state, the secular rulers, and then they would do all of that. The church wasn't allowed to harm you, because even then, in its incredibly distorted and perverted form, they understood that the church is a religion of peace, that it's not allowed to actually kill and harm people. So they would say, okay, well, then we're not going to protect you from the civil authorities. And then the civil authorities would do what they'd been doing, which was torturing people, all of that stuff, breaking the wheel, drawing and quartering. That was pre-Christian stuff. So in my argument, if you look at the Enlightenment, if you look at the end of slavery, if you look at all of that, that has to do with the conversion, the true religious conversion of Europeans, which took over 1,000 years for the teachings of the church to truly settle in. So there's that. Then you'd mention who's bringing the people together. I don't want to go on too long, but I just want to touch all your points. Bringing people
No, that's fine.
together.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think of the great mass of people as taking one of two forms: a herd or a flock. A herd is like a bunch of animals who gets frightened and they'll like start stampeding because they see other people doing it. It's something that's motivated out of fear, and there's no leadership. And so that produces, in that instance, people need to use violence in order to bring people together. And people do that. Demagogues, typically, they scare the herd gives them authority, and then they use that authority against the people. A flock is different. A flock is an aggregate of animals who are under the care of a shepherd. And this, to me, is true leadership. It's somebody who's been delegated authority because they inspire the best elements out of the human race. And then they use that authority to benefit the people, to lead them to a more civilized state of being. Solon of classical Athens is an example. He writes in his poems that, he could have, when he was given power, he could have sided with the aristocracy or he could have sided with the people. But he says, I was a bridge between the two of them. He looked out for the interests of both. And to me, that is a true shepherd of the people. So you're talking about, like, I think you are, like the Davos group and like world governments and international bankers and these elites who are manipulating things. That's a herd situation because they're using fear in order to get an objective that they want rather than what we want. So what is needed are visionaries who are not necessarily associated with organized capital, who are trying to benefit everyone and not just a tiny minority. Now, you'd also mentioned the bringing in migrants, and then you talked about rape cultures in various countries. So let me tell you something that bothers me a lot about the mainstream media. And it's something I call racial football. And it's where when something heinous like a rape or a murder or a stabbing or a shooting happens, people jump onto their computers, you go to the comment section, and they start speculating about what the identity of the perpetrator was. Was he a male? Was he cisgender? Was he transgender? Was he black? Was he white? Because if it's somebody that they don't like, it's somebody on the other side, they're like, score, yes, now we can paint everybody with a broad brush. But you're not looking at the crimes that people like you do. I don't care who does it, whether it's black people doing it against some white shooter or it's white people doing it against some black shooter, like the lady who got stabbed on the train. To me, it's childish because you're not looking at the complicating factors of the situation. We're not looking at mental health, the fact that that's not being adequately addressed. We're not looking at guns not being regulated properly, the fact that we have more guns in society than anywhere else in the world. We're not looking at how people are being brought into a society, whether the assimilation process is working or whether we're just bringing them in and not really preparing them to participate in this society. And as far you've mentioned the rapes that happen in different societies and how they're just like, oh yeah, we do that. Well, that makes them less hypocritical than people in the West, because if you actually do the numbers, the number of people, women and men, who've been molested or raped in America and in Europe is enormous, and especially for men because it's underreported. So to pretend like most of the rapes are happening in these societies and they're not happening here in the United States and in Europe, that's not true. What was the Epstein thing about? What was all that? I mean, maybe they're
I'm loath
sneakier.
to consider Epstein European. You must know that.
Well, but he grew up in America, though.
You're right, but and you can even look at the interviews with like Maria Farmer and the way that Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein and the people they moved with treated the girls. The girls were all dirty goy. You know, they were goyim. Maria Farmer was actually brave enough to say that that's what they. Ghislaine Maxwell, she said, was even worse than Jeffrey Epstein. Would just constantly bring her down, belittle her, break her emotionally for who she was. You know, you're not a Jew. You're just a dirty goy. And you need to wait outside the country club. Wait for when you're called upon to, you know, massage Jeffrey Epstein's clients or himself or something. But you don't get to come into the country club. This is for Jews, you know? So yeah, he lived in America, but they are a distinct people in many ways, and
What
certainly the
about
way that they look at themselves is distinct. And so anyway, I just wanted to,
yeah?
I
But
had
what
to
about
say,
Prince?
you
I
know,
know, but what about Prince Andrew and all their clientele?
right, right, right.
So
And
those are
look,
not Jews.
right now, the thing is though, you're almost about to undermine your own previous argument, which is that Christianity was a civilizational force that taught people you can't do this. So did it work, or is Western society still as rapey and violent and murderous as a non-Christian society? I mean, you can't kind of make both claims. It either worked and we're a more peaceful society, or it didn't. In which case, what's the point of Christianity then? What effect did it have? You know what I mean? You know what I'm getting at there?
No, I know what you're saying, but this is my argument: is that the Reformation, the conversion of the West is still ongoing. Uh, one of what I was writing a book, I may pick it up again, about how oftentimes religious stagnation is the result of thinking that you have arrived at the ultimate and final consummation of the Christian ideal. And I said, every time people have done that, a reformer has been needed to say, no, you're not. So obviously, Martin Luther is an example of that, but John Wycliffe was doing the same thing in England. And it was because a lot of people thought, okay, medieval Christianity, this is it. Even though you're torturing people, even though you are selling relics that you claim are the bones of saints, you are selling salvation to people with the myth of purgatory, which doesn't show up in the Bible one time. This is the ultimate form of Christianity, and it's so sad. There are so many people on the right nowadays who think a return to Catholicism is somehow going to solve all of humanity's problems. And I'm saying, no, it's not. There's a reason the Reformation happened. That was an incredibly corrupt system that needed, if not just to go, I think it did need to go. It needed a challenge. People needed an alternative to it. And so there's been this very slow conversion. And slavery is another example. So there's been a trajectory in the West that has centered upon oppression. So you look at ancient Rome, even Christian Rome had slaves. So then European church officials are like, well, we shouldn't be doing that. So it gets replaced with serfdom. Serfdom is a form of slavery, but it's not as bad as slavery. So then they're like, well, this isn't so good either. Of course, the Russians, who are part of a different tradition, keep their serfs a lot longer, which is what I was telling you about the difference between the true West and just Christianity, these other cultures in general, is that there's this constantly reevaluating, upgrading engine of progress that's taking place in the West constantly. So then they're like, okay, let's get rid of that. That's replaced by landlordism. Now you got peasants, free peasants, who are paying rents and tithes and things like that. Then they're like, not so good. So then they change it for industrial capitalism, and you've got the enclosure movement that pushes all the peasants off of the country estates and into cities. Now there's a new system. There's the bourgeoisie and there's the factory workers. And then they're like, well, this is kind of barbaric too, where they'd have substandard housing. So then that changes. The suburbs come into being, but the suburbs are now slaves to finance. So in order to participate in this form, this freer form of indentured servitude, but servitude nonetheless, you need to have credit. So now you've got the creditors and the lenders. That's the latest form. And then eventually it turns into corporations, the producers versus the consumers. And now it's students with student loans. And so you've got organized wealth constantly attacking people. And oftentimes the pushback against all of that has been Christians. It's been the church deciding to step outside of merely preaching that there's a life hereafter and saying, we need to build as close an approximation of the kingdom of heaven here on earth before we get to the here and after. Otherwise, we should not call ourselves followers of Christ. And so that's what's happening. So for me, when I look at all of the random acts of violence, I look at the rapes, I look at the molestation, whatever you want to say. When I look at that, I see them as symptomatic of spiritual, emotional, social maladies that are being unaddressed. We're looking at the symptoms, but we're not looking at the root cause, the disease. And it has everything to do with what we're talking about here and some things that we haven't mentioned, which to my mind is the male crisis, the crisis of masculinity, which if it is not addressed, whether you get your way or I get my way, whether you get these ethnically homogenous societies that you want to live in, or I get a more fully integrated global system, if we do not address the issue of masculinity and the male crisis of meaning, all of these same problems will crop up all over again.
And we will get to that, because I think that'll be an interesting topic, especially to end on, because I think we'll agree a lot. I would just say, even if, and I've said this before, even if there weren't so many rapes and stabbings and terrorist attacks and whatever else that goes on in Europe nowadays, and I don't think it's very random, unfortunately, I would still object to this project, because I don't believe in demographically transforming countries without those people's consent. And we were never asked is a slogan that is often repeated by some English nationalists. And it's a good slogan, but it's not quite true, because we were in fact asked all over Europe. We were asked about this. And the question was posed in America and in Australia and in Canada. The British voted for the Tories for 14 years to maintain rule in Britain, primarily because the Tories kept promising that they would stop mass migration. And what did they do instead? What were their actions? What were their actions? Well, they actually turned immigration up to 11. We had Boris wave and Sunak wave and all that stuff. El País, which is a liberal leftist newspaper based in Spain, they did a European Union-wide survey asking the respondents, do you think that your country has taken in too many migrants? And there isn't a single European country that responds below 70% in the affirmative, or like 68% in the affirmative, saying, yes, I agree, we've taken in too much all over Europe. And parties keep promising, whether it's on the populist right or even Keir Starmer, who's Labour in England, saying, I'm going to stop the boats. They all keep making these promises in order to get back into power, to win elections. It's such an important issue. So we have been asked. And in many, many cases, the overwhelming majority has said, no, we don't want this. Now, in part one, you mentioned that because I'm still not quite sure what it is you want and how it's different from the Davos people that you mentioned, or the global capitalists, or the NGOs that I think you would agree maybe are going about this badly. But the end goal that both you and them want seems to be the same. But then you mentioned that you don't want that the vision that you had of people, coming together doesn't necessarily mean population shifts and transplanting huge numbers of people. But now in this part, I'm wondering, it kind of sounds like it does. So for me, I don't care, or I would say I don't care. Even if there wasn't an increase in rapes, violent crimes, stabbings, terrorist attacks, all targeting the native European peoples in their respective countries, even if there wasn't catastrophic levels of black on white violence, like the ratio of black on white crime to white on black crime in the United States is shocking, and it has been for such a long time. Or even another example too, and these two examples kind of also go against your, not just yours, but like, the liberal globalist mantra of assimilation. We've had gypsies in Europe for like 1,000 years. They've never integrated. They've never assimilated. And what does that even mean anymore, assimilation? I haven't heard anyone except like kosher conservatives still use the term assimilation and integration. The left has completely passed that. They don't even bother pretending that we're going to have assimilation. They know, hell no, we aren't going to have assimilation. Everyone knows we haven't had assimilation, and it's only the populist right who says, no, we just need to keep our Judeo-Christian values and fight for our identity of the flag and all that. And if the burqa-wearing Muslims wave a British flag, it's all good. It's that's assimilation. Something it's ridiculous. But so my ultimate point is that even if it weren't for all of the catastrophic violence and the degradation of society, I don't think it's right for an Italian living in Brescia or an Englishman living in Birmingham, an English child, an Italian child, to grow up in basically Brazil or the United States. I grew up in the United States, and I left to go back to my fatherland, literally the land of my father, partly because I didn't want to live in a chaotic, multiracial society with all the problems that comes with. And I was looking forward to living in a homogeneous Italian society with Italian culture and people speaking Italian, and everyone kind of knowing the score and knowing this is how we are. We're all in agreement. We've all absorbed this culture and this history for thousands of years, and there's no interracial conflict going on. There's no Black Caucus. There's no we don't want to see why are there not enough Black players on the Italian national football team and all this kind of stuff. Well, now it all is happening. Actually, it all followed. It all came back. It chased me across the Atlantic Ocean. Now it's all the same. So I just still think it's actually morally wrong. I object to it to impose this on people, and the crime increase, the use of hand grenades and bombs increasing 500% in Sweden, peaceful little Sweden. That's just an extra helping of degradation. But the demographic replacement of Swedes was already bad enough. So am I wrong to think that? And why? How is your vision different than what's taking place, or how would you go about it better than Davos man is going about it?
Beautiful. Thank you for these questions. Okay, let's start with the demographic, the forced demographic change. So the fact of the matter is, I want to say this. I am not in favor of any forced change. What I am saying to you is this is happening, whether you or I like it or not. The difference between you and I is that I am embracing it and you are mourning something that is essentially lost. It's going away. and it's not coming back. Why is this happening? It's happening because if we don't have immigrants being brought into our societies will collapse. When the baby, during the 1950s, there were about 7 births for every retiree, meaning that the system could continue to self perpetuate itself. You had old people who would retire. You had at least 7 new workers that would come in and prop up Social Security with their taxes. That has changed. Now it's like 1 or 2. You can't support an apparatus, a welfare state like what we have to keep old people from potentially eating cat food after they leave the workforce because they can't afford anything else and they don't necessarily have a family that has the means to support them, with 1 to 2 new births for every retiree. That's not going to happen. If you look at Japan, you've got um, plummeting birth rates, and it's happening across the board. And it has to do with industrialization. Industrialization changed everything. So unless you're able to go back to like almost the Stone Age and get rid of industry and get rid of all the technological advances that you and I currently enjoy, which is why we're on this phone call, you have to have enough of a labor force in order to prop this highly complicated system up. And you can't just rely upon native births. Even in countries like, is it Sweden, Switzerland? I forget where. There's a European country that is like trying to subsidize people to have more children. It's not working.
Oh yeah, that could be Hungary as well. Yeah, it didn't
Yeah,
really work. Like Hungary's birth rate went up like 0.2%.
it
Yeah,
doesn't work.
yeah, it didn't work.
The fact of the matter is, this has been the case in America from the start, which is why immigrants from what were considered undesirable countries were brought in order to supply the necessary children who would grow up and become adults who had a stake in the system, who weren't afraid to go out, work, have babies young, and start their families. Okay, it takes about 20 years in order to see a noticeable difference in birth rates. We don't have that kind of time. So that's number one. You
Okay,
need,
can I just
yeah.
interrupt, because I actually completely disagree, and I have sources. I got a source, bro. Okay, so the idea that we need to have, as Joe Biden put it, years ago in a famous video where he's speaking, and he says we need a constant, unrelenting stream of immigration, and it's a good thing. Apparently, you're work, and white people are gonna be a minority, the abject minority. That's a good thing. Okay, why? But again, it's not actually true. So this is all actually it's actually costing us more than anything. Studies out of the Netherlands have shown that the Netherlands is paying like something like 600 million or even billion euros on migrants. There was a study in the United Kingdom that found that immigration has not driven economic growth. Salaries have remained, what has been the case is that salaries remain low or stagnant, and the cost of inflation keeps going up because, as I argue, more than anything, the main drivers of this demographic shift, these population shifts, this mass migration, the main drive behind Boris wave or mass migration to Canada, which has just been shocking, it's actually the business class wanting to keep the cost of labor down. That's their primary objective. It's a huge thing that many people on the right, especially the American so-called right, the conservative, Matt Walsh types, it's very unlikely that they'll ever touch this because they would require criticizing capitalism, and they don't want to do that. Then David Coleman, who's the professor of demography at Oxford University, said that if you were going to use immigration as an economic engine to rev up the economic engine, you would actually have to use such high numbers of immigration as to replace the native population. That's replace migration. That's the far right conspiracy, far right racist conspiracy that every time we say great replacement, replace migration, there comes, Grok's AI analysis to say this post reflects a far right racist conspiracy theory of replacement migration. But like qualified intellectuals are even running models saying that that's what would have to happen. And then even recently, let me see what it was just real quick here. This was, I found, very, very interesting and kind of a game changer. I think it was the University of, let's just find it here. Save photos, don't know. Well, I think I shared it on Twitter, but anyway, a university that starts with C, might have been the University of Columbia, found that there is no correlation between an aging population and a decrease in economic performance. And that confirms what Larry Fink of BlackRock said at one of the recent World Economic Forums, where he said, and I'd like to know, what's the writing on the wall that he has seen? This guy's probably tapped into so many things and knows so much more than we do about what's going on and what's going to happen. And he said that in the coming future, countries with smaller populations will actually do better than countries with bigger populations. Because with AI and robots and automation, the countries with smaller populations will be able to adapt easier. They won't have a huge population of displaced workers. Meanwhile, the countries with big populations are going to figure out what to do with a bunch of unemployed people that now are obsolete. So we have a situation where the third world migrants haven't paid into the pension system. We've just seen Germany proposes raising the retirement age to 73. France is cutting national holidays and also addressing the pension problem. And these are both countries that have had massive immigration from incompatible racial and cultural sources. It hasn't worked. They haven't upheld the pension system. They haven't driven economic growth. They've actually done the opposite. And even if it were to work, it would require such huge numbers that you would have to replace the native white people. Okay. And I don't think that's right. I would object. And you mentioned the Japanese. I don't want Japan to become a demographically replaced, just gray goop like Britain, like the United States. I've never been to Japan. I guess it's too late for me to go and enjoy a Japan that's truly Japanese because it's going to become like everywhere else. And then you mentioned that America, in its moments of baby bust, which is another point that's really interesting too, is that fertility line graphs often do look like rolling hills. If you look at the timeline, there's ups and downs, there's peaks and valleys. And I don't think that something that is such a permanent solution, like changing the entire demography of your country, to something that could very well be just a temporary problem, like a baby bust, is the best path to take. But more to the point, I don't really give a damn what America did because I don't believe in the American model as something to follow. I think that treating your population like worker drones or cogs in machinery and treating your country like just an economic zone or a business is a very corrosive American capitalist idea that I don't want to see other nations copying. So I did have to interject there because I've heard this all before, and I'm every day seeing that it doesn't work. And then lo and behold, in the dark corners, with no light being shined upon them, there are actual intellectuals, experts in these fields, whether it's economics or demography, confirming my suspicions and also what I'm seeing in daily life, but they don't get any attention. The smug, educated liberal likes to talk down to people like me and say that, oh, read a book, you know, which one, first of all. But it's really annoying to find out, oh my gosh, there's all these universities and all these professors and all these tenured, you know, PhD holding intellectuals and experts in their fields who do agree with me, but they're just never given any attention. And I find that very frustrating because, like you said, I think you said, we don't have time. You're right. We don't have time for this. I don't think, and I can talk about baby bus and stuff. There are so many factors going behind the birth rate decrease, which is happening all over the world too. It's not just happening in Japan and Europe and North America. It's happening in the Muslim world. It's happening in Asia, you know, not Far East, but like South Asia, Bangladesh, India's birth rates are even going down. It's happening even in Africa. And you're right. It's one of the causes of industrialization. But another cause of many is when they get in contact with liberalism. Women's lib starts the ball rolling on decreased birth rates. When women start getting access to education and going into the workforce, birth rates go down. Technology, advances in technology can cause be another factor in decreasing birth rates. And then even more interesting, the migrant communities, whether it's from the Muslim world or South Asia or African Christians, within a generation or two of them being in the West, their birth rates go down too. So it's not working as a solution. And even if it did, they get old too. So eventually they'll need to be taken care of by the pension system. So what are we going to do? Just have this massive, never-ending, like Joe Biden said, never-ending, it's not even a stream anymore, it's a gushing river of people transfers to uphold this pyramid scheme. Well, I think that the better solution would be to address this economic model, which doesn't seem to be holding up anymore in modernity. We need fresh ideas, new ideas. And we should be able to get these ideas now because we have the internet and everyone can now share ideas. But there's lots of powerful interests that like this system. So it's not going to happen. So back to you.
Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, you said a lot of really great things, and my only issue with what you're saying is that you're conflating a bunch of stuff. You said the problem is the economic model. You're right. Capitalism is predicated upon the notion of infinite growth, and there can't be infinite growth. But that's not a racial issue. That's not a cultural issue. Okay? So you're right. The way that immigration is taking place within the first world is haphazard, and it's being done poorly because economic considerations are getting in the way of careful government planning. But again, that's not a racial issue. That has to do with greed. That has to do with the fact that a tiny elite are controlling duly elected politicians through lobbying. So the organized capital is circumventing the will of the people for the sake of wealth. And we are allowing this because we just believe we have made the American dream or the whatever dream, the dream of the new world, synonymous with the opportunity to become as rich as Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. That's a different issue. So that's number one. Plato often says, or he said in one of my favorite dialogues, nothing in and of itself is evil. It's the manner in which it's done. There is an old saying, the ends justify the means. They never do. But oftentimes the means justify the ends. If immigration is being done in a manner that protects the interests of the native population and allows the migrants to come in and live fulfilled lives with a rising standard of living, that's great. But if it's being done in such a way that generates ethnic conflict, it's not the issue of immigration, it's the way that it's being done. That's a problem with leadership and its relationship to organized capital. So that's number one. Number two, this whole great replacement stuff, Angelo, I don't believe in that. And let me tell you why. there are approximately 1.1 billion, not million, billion white people in the world. White people are not going anywhere. There are about 1.2 or 3 billion black people in the world. They're not going anywhere. And yet, I hear on both sides, black and white, racial demagogues who are saying the system is trying to get rid of you. They're going to eliminate you, and you're not going to be. And it's just like, no, it's not. You are trying, and I'm not saying you, but these demagogues. You're trying to scare people into believing that their ethnic group is being eradicated so that you can get racial power, so that you can clout chase and you can bring attention to yourself. There's a dude named Dr. Umar Johnson. He has a degree. He's a black nationalist. He goes around haranguing and lecturing black people who have interracial relationships, because to him, that's taking wealth out of the black community, and we're in this racial war, and the powers that this global system of white supremacy is trying to eliminate black people. And the sad thing is, there are some white people who have wanted to do that. There's a dude who wrote this book called The Turner Diaries, where it's this racialist fantasy of eliminating all non-white peoples. And when I think about the fact that there are some people who want to get rid of not just entire ethnic groups, entire races, that to me is insane. What kind of a dark tunnel in the ground do you have to exist in your mind to want to eliminate an entire class of people? That's crazy to me. And yet it's because they fall into these paranoid conspiracy frameworks where they start thinking, oh, we're going to disappear. You're not going anywhere. Stop believing this nonsense. You're not going to wipe out 1 billion white people or 1 billion black people. It's not going to happen.
Okay. Well, like I said, this isn't going to be a debate, so I'm not going to try and show you up or prove you wrong or have a gotcha. I'm just going to present to you some facts. And first of all, let me just say too, the people you mentioned, they're like William Luther Pierce and things that they believe. That's why I'm sometimes, and that's why it took me many years to become fully involved in this thing, because there's a lot of distasteful characters out there, or maybe they seem much more distasteful. Then you kind of read about them a bit more and say, okay, maybe they're not that bad, but they did, okay, that's pretty wild. I have to admit that, but I do agree with him over here. But I personally don't want to wipe out any races. And I do find it interesting, at least, that you admit races exist and they are different peoples. And that's, I think, important, because some people even now say, we're all the same. But then what is diversity? So anyway, it gets all muddled. But I do believe that people can be put into, racial definitions. It helps us understand things, just as it helps us understand how a Siberian tiger is different than a Bengal tiger, even though they're both tigers, they're both mammals, they're both felines, but we distinguish them for various reasons and important reasons. So with that out of the way, the Great Replacement is happening. I can't, it's not only anecdotal personal experience that I could share with you. The European Union tells us that it is. The European Union has something called the Becoming a Minority Project, which is a research project where they track cities, major cities in Europe, where the native European population of these respective countries is now the minority. Or there's something, again, it was funded by the EU, and then it was through a Dutch publishing house. They put out a book called The Minority Majority, which is about how Europe is being transformed, and there's now going to be these minority communities that represent the majority of the population of various European cities or regions, or eventually, I assume, countries altogether. Again, backed by the European Union. They were funded with a European Union grant. So my tax euros are going to confirmation projects that confirm this is happening. There was something else put out by the European Commission called, I think it was called like the Demographic Tracker or something like that. It's actually a database that's tracking the demographic changes happening. The only thing is, It's the celebration parallax. When I say it's happening, it's a far-right racist conspiracy theory, and you're just being paranoid. Stop it, shut up. But when Ursula von der Leyen says it, or the European Union or the European Commission funds research projects confirming it, but they celebrate it as a good thing, then it is happening. Now, I can't speak for what's going on in Africa. Like I said, the birth rates are going down on the African continent. I'm not sure what the situation is like in the African American community. Maybe there's fears of demographic. I know, for example, in Chicago, I saw a couple of years back that the Black community in Chicago was upset because they're getting muscled out by Latin immigrants, and they felt like, what's going on here? We're now the minority in what used to be our neighborhoods, which is, I think, on a lower scale, a type of demographic replacement. It's not that this is something that comes up often when we talk about replacement migration, or Renaud Camus' phrase, the great replacement. It's not that white people are vanishing. Although if birth rates go the way they are, there will be fewer and fewer white people in relation to the numbers of non-white people. As even if birth rates are going down worldwide, they're still, basically what's happened is the birth rate in Africa generally went from like 6.2 to 5.1 very quickly. Okay, it's a decrease, but they're still having many more children than Europeans or white Americans, white Australians, etc. The way I see it is like, if you have a bowl of oranges and a bowl of pears on your kitchen counter, if you take out a bunch of oranges from the bowl of oranges and put them somewhere else in the refrigerator, and then you take a bunch of pears from the bowl of pears and put them in the bowl of oranges, and now there are more pears in the bowl of oranges. Well, it's not that oranges went extinct, but in that bowl that previously was only oranges, there are now 2 or 3 oranges and 15 pears. And this is a very strange metaphor, but let's imagine that those oranges said, hey, where did all of our oranges go? And who are all these pears? We were never asked. We don't like this. This is like a VeggieTales episode now, but, so when I hear, and again, this isn't, like I said, this isn't I called this round 1 and round 2 with the tongue firmly in cheek. I don't want you to feel like I'm, trying to do a gotcha or, coming back at you hard, but please understand that when someone says it's not happening and I'm just being manipulated by demagogues who are playing on paranoias, I can assure you that that's not the case for me. I've seen it, I've lived it, and also, again, the celebration parallax. I'm told it's a good thing from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, from the European Union, that this is happening, but it's good. So when I hear someone say it's not happening, I bristle.
Can I ask you a question? Angelo, what is your fear? What is your big fear? Because you just said you don't think white people are vanishing. It's impossible to get rid of 1 billion people. What is your greatest fear?
I don't even think it's fear. It's just, I'll give you an example. I was visiting family in a rural part of Italy not too long ago. And on the long train ride to get to where they live, I had to stop at various stations. And at one point, we changed trains in a station. And it's not a big city. It's not a major transport hub, but again, I still think even that the population shifts that are happening in big cities is wrong. I object to it. But what I mean to say is, I wasn't somewhere where people would say, well, what did you expect? It's a big city. It's Milan. It's London. What did you expect? It was just a normal transport hub. You change trains here to keep along this southbound route. And as I was waiting for the train, I was the only white person. I was surrounded by North Africans and subcontinental Asians. And that feels weird.
Why?
And then when Wouldn't it?
What
Especially when you're used to Italy being full of Italians and the sound of the musical sounds of people speaking Italian, and you just feel like you belong and you feel nice. It's just nice. It's nice to
but
feel. Go ahead.
can
Go ahead.
I want to ask you a question though, because you're getting to the meat, I think, of the issue, which is it you just want to be surrounded by people with a specific skin color, or is it a cultural issue? Like, what is it that is so objectionable to you? Why is being on a train in Italy and seeing a bunch of black people, why does that irritate
Well, they
you?
weren't even necessarily black. Like I said, they were North African. So like
Okay,
Maghrebis.
okay, them. Why
That's a
did that
huge.
ir-
It's a huge. Immigration to Italy is coming mostly from places like Morocco
Okay,
and Algeria and Tunisia and places like that. One of the reasons is because that same demographic of migrants is massively overrepresented in crime. The statistical majority of the population of Italy's juvenile detention centers, or AKA prisons, is expressly from that same Maghrebi immigrant population. When it gets to adult crime, the percentages are the same. So if I'm
can I
there with my wife, and then we're thinking about having children, and now we are surrounded by North African youths who are extremely overrepresented in crime, yeah, I've got my head on a swivel. But 30 years ago, it wouldn't have been like that, that train station. It would have been nice Italian people having an espresso, having a cigarette, and chatting in Italian and waiting for the train.
can I ask you a question? So if they weren't overrepresented in crime, would you still care?
Well, that's what I said earlier. Yes, because I object to ethnic cleansing done politely.
Okay, so really the issue is not the crime. The issue is you don't want to see people, you don't want to see these people in what you consider to be white Italian spaces. That's the issue.
I don't like seeing a huge, unwanted, unasked for, and unjustifiable demographic change that amounts to, as I just put it, ethnic cleansing, but done politely. And like I said, so I've been around a lot to different places. I've worked alongside North Africans and Sub-Saharan Africans. I've told this story before, but I'll share it again. I worked in a kitchen in Bordeaux, France, and I was a runner in this big brasserie. And it had, the kitchen was underground, and it had 3 floors on which there was dining rooms. And then there was even another kitchen. It was where the grill station was actually up above one of these other floors. And my job was to run up and down stairs carrying platters, trays full of plates, and deliver them to the waiters, who would then deliver them to the diners. And it was a tough job. The only other people who did my job were a Tunisian and an Algerian guy. And then occasionally there would be like a French kid, young student, who was doing it to make a few euros, pocket money. But mostly it was me and some other North Africans, and they were Muslims, of course. And we got on fine. And I remember there was this one night where someone had left a bottle of water. It was always so hot. We were always sweating and always thirsty. So knowing whose bottle of water belonged to whom was important. You wanted to have your own bottle of water or Coca-Cola or whatever. And there was this bottle of water. It looked ice cold. It had a little condensation, was dripping down. And the Tunisian or the Algerian asked, whose water is this? Because he wanted maybe to drink it or something. And people say, I don't know, whose water is this? Is this yours? Is this yours? And there was so much going on. We had to be really paying attention to orders coming in and orders going out, that I just said, look, it's God's water. Drink it if you want it. It's God's water, right? And because these were, devout Muslims, they both stopped and offered me their hands in like this moment of finally we bonded, and they wanted to shake my hand. Wow, you're so wise. You're so profound. Okay. It's not that I hate Muslims or people with different skin color or anything like that. It's that I object to what is going on at scale. I object to the transformation of villages, cities, neighborhoods just in the same way that blacks in Chicago objected to the loss of their neighborhood through Latin American immigration. I think it's normal for people to be used to something, to identify with it, to have a sense of belonging, and then to feel unhappy about it being taken away or transformed into something that's not quite as good without their consent.
Can I ask you a question? Have you had any close friendships with non-white people?
I haven't had that many close friendships at all, to be honest. Yeah, I
Really?
moved. Yeah, well, it's partly because I moved around a lot. I went to different high schools. I have lived in different countries. I was kind of an outsider growing up in America, but then when I moved back to Italy, I'm kind of an outsider in Italy because I came from America. So it's always been a bit difficult for me to have a sense of belonging, which is why I value it so much. The I once spoke with someone from Andalusia, Spain. We were just talking. We were just having a drink, and he was sharing how much he loved being from uh, the Betico area of Andalusia, of Cordoba, of the Betis area. And at one point, he was so overcome with the sense of pride and place and belonging that he actually went down and kissed the ground. He said, yo soy Betico. Esta es mi tierra. And then he gets on the ground and kisses the ground just to show how much he loved. And I just thought that was beautiful. I love the fact that people can have that sense because I don't, but I can
Okay.
admire it in other people. And I don't want to see it taken away from them.
So, you know what you've described there is very telling for me coming from you, because it sounds to me like you are turning communal and racial and um, ethnic uh, I don't know, affability, uh, connectivity into a proxy for something that probably you needed more than that, which was interpersonal connections on a more than surface level. So for me, I have had many close connections and relationships with people from various groups. And this has a lot to do with the fact that you and I don't see eye to eye. And it's because I can't look at a demographic in isolation and say, those are my people, because they're not. When I went to college, when I was at that university, that Christian university, there was a decent sized African American population. And I went and spent some time with them, and I recognized something about myself. I began to realize that I was a little bit of a snob. I've changed a little bit, maybe not. But I hanging out with the black people there, I recognized three distinct groups. And I'll just call them the A group, the B group, and the C group. The C group was a cohort that I didn't want anything to do with. They were ignorant, embarrassing. They would say things that would make me cringe coming from my background. Uh, all they for them, college was just about money. It wasn't about personal transformation. And so I tended to sort of avoid them. Then there was the B group. This was the I would call the mostly respectable cohort of black people in college. They were hardworking students. They were professionally minded, but they were also conscious. And by conscious, I mean they were aware of that legacy of struggle that African Americans have had to endure in order to get to where we are currently. They would make up mostly the professional class. They would go on to become ministers. They would go on to start businesses, entrepreneurs. They would go on to become dentists and doctors and nurses and things of that nature. And I was friends with a lot of them, and they kind of looked at that other group, the C group, which not a few black Republicans belong to, who they would deny that racism exists. They would try to whitewash history. They were just totally out of touch with the black experience unless it was in a derogatory manner. They were what I would call ghetto. But the B group wasn't like that. And most of the really thriving Black metropolises are populated by members from the B group, that professional class. They go to school, they go out, they build families and communities and things of that nature. And then there was what I called the A group, and this was the group that I was most comfortable with. These were African Americans who, were they aware of that struggle? Yes, and they paid homage to it the way that I do. Some of their heroes were men like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and W.E.B. Du Bois and all of the great pioneers who kept pushing for the actualization of those words in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, and they are all endowed with inalienable rights by their creator. And so you deserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's your job to go out there and, with a little help from the divine, make your dreams come true. But they also, there was another part of them that was especially appealing to me. And it was that they weren't constrained by it. Sometimes the members of the B group would limit what they were willing to do based on this concept of Blackness. Like, well, that's what the white people do. But the A group weren't like that. They were like, no. Part of what has been a part of the African American trajectory has been stepping outside of artificially constructed racial boundaries and doing things that are not expected of us. Because ultimately, we are a people within a larger a larger category, namely the human race, and it's our job to contribute to global society, that canon of excellences that have been preserved by intellectuals and built by creative people. And so these are individuals like Marian Anderson, who became the first Black opera singer to perform European art songs on European stages. And at first people were like, you're a Black person, you shouldn't be singing European art music, but she did. And Jean Sibelius actually said, my roof is too low for you, because she was so musically gifted. And there have been so many people like John Leroy Locke, who became the first Black Rhodes Scholar to get that scholarship and go to Oxford. Let me see, what was his name? It was it? I forget his name, but he was the first Black classicist. He was an inspiration for me to go into classics. And so they weren't constrained by it, but they were aware of it and they were respectful to it. And my closest friend group belonged to that. But I was also friends with a lot of white people and a lot of Jewish people. When I was getting my master's degree, my closest friend was a Jewish woman. We hung out all the time. We'd call each other once a week, and we would spend time in class. She would help me with things, I would help her with. We were great friends. And it's because for me, my people have always been individuals who align with my inner personality, my values, my sense of being in this world. And it had nothing to do with race. And I look at white people the same way. It's the same categories. You've got a C group who I would want nothing to do with, who are sometimes my enemies. You've got the B group, who is just decent people. And then you've got that A group that I love being around. And I'll make friends with anybody. The other thing is this. So my advice to you, and you are a part, there are a lot of men, not just white men or Black men or Asians or Hispanics. There are a lot of men like you who haven't been given the kind of social and emotional formation, development that allows them to have these kinds of relationships. And so they throw all of their eggs into one basket, which is, I need to get married and I need to have children because that's the only real family that I'm going to have. Or, well, that and my racial ethnic family. And it's like, no, if that is your worldview and your schema in life, you're going to miss out on the richest experience that you could ever have, which is when you connect with your spiritual family, your intellectual family, the family that connects with you on a level that even your own blood relatives could never, because they're so much like you. You guys fit each other like a hand in glove. And that's what I want to do. I want to help train, especially men. Women don't have it as bad, but men have it. Connect with your spiritual family, build your spiritual tribe. Plato loved Athens. He was raised in Athens, and he was actually a part of the aristocracy in Athens. But he ended up leaving Athens because he said finding adequate friends had become so difficult there. So he goes to Syracuse and he meets someone, Dion of Syracuse, with whom he can have a bond, the likes of which he had never experienced anywhere. And he says, until those who philosophize, those from the tribe of philosophers, can get together and become philosopher statesmen, he says every city state will continue to be run badly. So he's talking about a different tribe, those who philosophize. He doesn't specify race, he doesn't specify ethnicity, none of that, because he understood that it is an international, ethnic, interlinguistic, cosmopolitan group. And I belong to that group. And so when I meet people who belong to that group, it excites me, not whether they're black or white. I just care about their soul, who they are on the inside, not what they look like. So that's why I was asking your question. Do you just want to be around people who look like you, or are you looking at the content of the person's character? So that's number one. The next thing, I want to talk about Chicago, because one of the things that we're discussing is racial differences and whether or not they're based upon race. So I don't know if you know much about the history of Chicago. Do you? Before I go on, do you know much about Chicago's history?
Grew up pretty much in Chicago.
Okay, but
Yeah.
what the beginning though?
Well, I mean, from when it was a swamp, and then they reversed the river, and all that. Like, what else would be the beginning?
Do you know how it became how the ghetto developed there?
No, well, I mean, if we were going back to, I thought we were going back to like Joliet and them, but no. As far as the history of like the Black community in Chicago, no, I'm not terribly informed about that.
Okay, let me tell you about it. So basically, what happened is after the Civil War. And Reconstruction was a disaster at assimilating Black people into the culture because of the Ku Klux Klan, because they were determined to keep Blacks from voting and from participating in the newly developing economy of the Gilded Age, because they didn't want to see these ex-slaves on a par with them. A lot of Black people either accepted a kind of post-slavery form of slavery in the South, or they left. And what happened was what you call the Great Migrations. So Chicago was a developing city, and many of them thought this is a place where we can go and start over in the big city. So they get there, and again, the Black community there's like three groups. There's people who were the lower class. Then you had a solid working class. These were people like mechanics, carpenters, waiters, stuff like that. They did jobs that were not considered high value, but provided for a solid life because things were cheaper back then. Okay. And then you had a solid upper class of Blacks. These were Blacks who had advanced degrees, at least a college education. They were teachers, doctors, lawyers, nurses, what we would consider to be wealthy at the time. They get to Chicago. Each of these groups expects to have housing commensurable with their income prospects and their education levels. And guess what? The whites in Chicago were like, no, you don't. It doesn't matter the fact that you are a doctor and that you're making this much money. You're not moving into this neighborhood. This is for white people. They didn't care that these people oftentimes were culturally not very distinct from them, because back then, if you got an education, you received not just an education in your trade, but in Anglo-Saxon culture, in waspy values. So John Locke, he went over to England, was hanging out with British aristocrats. They completely accepted him because they understood that culturally they were the same. Du Bois went to Harvard, went to the University of Berlin, hanging out with Germans, went to France. I think he could speak French. He was multilingual, but he could not get a job at a predominantly white institution. Why? Racial prejudice, even though culturally he was no different. So at first, there was a fight. The Black community used every method at its disposal in order to integrate into these communities, not putting low class people into upper class neighborhoods, but upper class Blacks into upper class white communities. There were lawsuits, there was political agitations, protests, and sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. But what would happen is that anytime the legal system worked, the white community would use illegal methods in order to get around that. So for example, if you were a white realtor and you sold a house to a Black person, they would throw rocks through your window of your business or burn it down. They were determined not only to disrupt ordinary business practices, but to prevent even progressive whites from doing what was the morally right thing to do. And so the fights go on. Sometimes it turns into actual violence where you got white people and Black people fighting, killing each other. And then eventually a change happens. First of all, the cops create a crime district within the Black community. So if you are selling bootlegged alcohol or you are prostituting, if you're in a predominantly Black neighborhood, the whites won't come. They won't arrest you, nothing. If you try to do that in the white community, you're not allowed to do that. You get arrested immediately. Number two, a new philosophy had come into being by people like Marcus Garvey. It's called racial uplift, Black nationalism. And it said, why are you Black people trying to integrate with these white people? They don't want you there anyway. Here's what you need to do. Stay in your own community and build wealth. Let them have their white-only zones and forget about your constitutionally protected rights, okay? Let's just focus on money because that's why they're doing this. They don't want us taking houses for them. They don't want to have to compete with us. So let's just do the same thing on our score. And Booker T. Washington had done something similar, but for different reasons. Booker T. Washington was not in favor of segregation. He had to say that because he was trying to build a school in the South called the Tuskegee Institute, and the whites would not have allowed him to do that if they thought he was training Black gentlemen. Their greatest fear was a Black person who was educated, who saw himself on the same level as a white person, and they knew education was what did that. But when he said, no, we're just training them to be better workers and servants and things like that, and we're not teaching them to integrate, they're like, okay, you can do it. We're not going to send the Klan over to burn your school down. So after this philosophy of Black nationalism comes into being, and Black people stop fighting for the most part in Chicago to join societies based upon income level and education and jobs, what happens is the line between the Black and the white community becomes congealed and hardened. Crime becomes a fixture in the Black community for two reasons. A, the kinds of job opportunities. Once white people left the city because they didn't want to fight Black people for the housing, and they went into the suburbs, now you've got people getting the best jobs in the cities who don't live there, so they're not paying taxes. So you've got what's it called? Urban decay. Okay, buildings are not being taken care of. You've also got exploitative landlords, some of them Jewish, some of them white people, and others, who are charging the same rent, the same amount of money to live in slums as white people are paying, in good old suburbia and in nice neighborhoods. Okay, you've got that. So you don't have the jobs, you've got up rents, you've got urban decay, and you also have a crime district. So the children of the two classes who were hardworking and highly educated, they are raised in this environment. They look at the unjust situation and they're like, why are we playing along with the rules? So many of them start joining gangs, organized crime, because they're like, I'm going to make money at all costs, and I'm not going to play the rules of a game that is rigged against me. That is where the violence comes into being. The cause of it were those white racists who refused to acknowledge the intellectual and professional achievements of the classes who wanted to move into their neighborhoods. So the reason I'm saying that to you, number one, we are like white on black crime, and no. Crime in general is a result of systemic oppression. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the key issue was black nationalism. And people who embrace white nationalism, it's the same thing. White nationalist countries do not do better than countries that are more progressive and liberal. They don't do better. The reason why Germany suffered economically and probably lost the war is when the National Socialists took over, scores of their finest citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish, fled the country because they were no longer welcome, because they were still committed to the eternal values of truth and objectivity, and not just promoting something in the issue of race. So directors like Otto Preminger, he left. Albert Einstein left. Like all these, there's so many physicists who fled Germany, social scientists. And 70% of these people came to the United States. The Manhattan Project was the result of intellectuals who had been chased out of Germany, and Germany turned into a highly civilized, a highly industrially developed version of a ghetto. People are playing around with it, and I even saw you in a video referring to the mustached man as Uncle A. He was not this avuncular person that you would want to be around. It was scary. You had to watch what you said. You couldn't think for yourself. It wasn't just bad on Jews. Hermann Hesse, who's one of my favorite authors, he was being scorned and persecuted because he didn't want to get on board with what he saw as a gross distortion and perversion of German culture. Thomas Mann left. He's probably a greater writer than Hermann Hesse. All of these elites ended up leaving. Martin Heidegger, probably the greatest philosopher in Germany at the time, the guy who invented phenomenology. No, well, actually, it was Husserl, who was another one, but Martin Heidegger expanded it. He had taken over the rectorship. I forget the university. It might have been. Was it? No, I forget I don't want to misspeak. But he had taken over. He had joined the Nazi Party, and then when he saw what was happening, he resigned it. This is a philosopher. This is not some hillbilly who doesn't understand how problematic the Jews were. This is somebody who had studied with a Jew, Edmund Husserl, who actually invented phenomenology, and who was steeped in the best of Europe's intellectual culture. And when he saw how the National Socialists had changed German society, he abandoned his post. That should tell you something. You get this ethnically homogenized society that you're yearning for and you're wanting, and it is not going to give you what you want. Either way, whether we become a globalized society or this racial pipe dream of remigrating peoples and making racially purifying society is going to happen, you will not get your way. You will get something that is ugly, that eliminates all of the things that I appreciate and other intellectuals appreciate about Europe, about Japan, about America, that have to do with cultural diffusion.
Okay, a lot to go there to talk about in that. We're coming up to the end of time, so I was almost thinking we'll do like final statements. So I'll do a response to what you said there. That'll be like my final statement, and I'll give it back to you. So again, you mentioned the inevitability of all this, and like we discussed before, you might be right. You might be right. There might be this invisible guiding hand that this is just the way things are going. Age of Aquarius is happening, but you might be wrong. I mean, when Keir Starmer says we have to stop this senseless immigration, otherwise we're going to become an island of strangers, one of the most remarkable phrases of any political speech in recent times. You have the so-called vibe shift happening in the United States. You have J.D. Vance delivering this speech in Munich where people went insane about it, but he didn't really say anything that Viktor Orban hasn't said before or Matteo Salvini hasn't said before on the floor of the European Parliament to the very same people that Vance spoke to. But then you have, like I mentioned earlier, surveys, polling data showing that people want an end to this and they want something different. And if you ask them, would you support remigration? The results are overwhelmingly positive. These people were brought here. They can be made to leave. And in fact, because of the presence of so many of them, because one of the things I'm going to respond to involves this very point, which is scale. But as you import the third world and your country then becomes the third world, there aren't that many economic benefits to stay there anymore. And people are actually going back to their countries of origin of their own will, of their own volition. People of Black Caribbean origin who came to or were born in Britain are now going back to Black Caribbean countries. The wars in Syria that led to the so-called refugee crisis, they're over. If Syrians that are living in Germany are going on holiday in Syria on German taxpayers' dime, or euro rather, then they can be sent back to Syria for good. If it's safe enough for them to go on holiday there, it's safe enough for them to live there. War's over. Refugees traditionally don't get a right to stay indefinitely. The whole point is that when it's safe to go back, you go back. So I'm not so sure that's all inevitable. And then as far as getting what I want, you mentioned that in Nazi Germany, you had to watch what you say. And, if you end up in a ghetto, things will get ugly. I have to watch what I have to say in a liberal democracy. This is going to be uploaded to YouTube. We've talked about Jews and we've said the RAPE word. This video might get taken down. Talk about ugliness. My God, I can tell you about ugliness. The ugliness that has been caused by this neoliberal or just liberal or progressive or whatever term you want to use. These policies, these actions that have led to the world that I grew up in, the world that I tried to escape, but then saw recreated a continent away, an ocean away. And it looks like it's going to be recreated in other places too, because even though the results, the fruit of this tree is obviously bitter, they're still going about it anyway. And I don't care if I lose Albert Einstein. This is something, there's like a niche argument in some of the erstwhile alt-right sphere. And then this also comes up, this conversation that we're having is actually very similar to conversations I have with Euro-federalists or people who are pro-European Union or something like it. They believe that the world is entering this phase of no longer even nation states or ideological states. They believe that the world is approaching sort of the empirical state, the civilizational state. And it's going to be basically Russia versus North America, which will be now united, Canada, United States, and Mexico as one. And then the global South, and then Europe. Well, if Europe remains these scattered, leaderless nation states, will be passed by. Will be crushed by these massive civilizational states, the North American one, the Russian one, etc. And so the conversation that we're having here is very similar, because people say to me, for example, how do you think that Slovenia can compete with China? And my response is, it's not Slovenia's destiny to compete with China. Slovenia's destiny was to become an independent homeland for the Slovenian people. Or they'll say that Ireland, Ireland is this island. It has nothing. how do you expect it to compete with China? Again, Ireland's unfulfilled destiny, it's still unfulfilled, is to be the united, independent homeland of the Irish people. Patrick Pearse said, we are fighting. For what did he say? We are fighting for an Ireland that is not just free, but Gaelic. And not just Gaelic, but free. And you still have a divide. You still have Northern Ireland. So all these centuries later, it's still an unfulfilled destiny. It's not Ireland's destiny to compete on the global stage with China and the United States. It's impossible for that to happen. But that doesn't mean that Ireland is irrelevant and the Irish people are irrelevant and meaningless. Oh, what? You don't have a huge GDP like China and India and the United States? Well, no, but they have something else. They have other things. And those things are important to the Irish people, important enough that they fought for centuries and centuries and centuries. So you can have your Einsteins and whatever else, but in day-to-day life, you value other things as well. And that's another point, is that a lot of what you're saying is cosmopolitan. A lot of what you're saying is upper class, intellectual, even, I dare say, privileged. What about the working class guys? What about the people who aren't going to universities and having wonderful, intellectually stimulating conversations with people from all over the world? What about the guy who just works as a mechanic? What about the guy who works in a cooperage? What about the guy who's working not even a manual labor job like that? What about the guy who just works an office job that slowly kills him? Okay, but then he goes back home. He takes a tram or a metro full of third worlders blasting their music. Everything's totally different than the society he grew up in. Then he goes to live in this drab block of flats, pays an exorbitant rent to live in what is basically a shoebox, and maybe he's even cohabitating with 2 or 3 other people because the rent's so high they need to share the costs. Okay, you might say that it's really great to have a spiritual or an intellectual bond with a philosopher class, but the people I just mentioned will never have that. Instead, what they have is this ugliness. And then on top of that, if they object, and this is, I know that particularly Americans like to think that, this only happens in the UK or Germany or Europe in general. But even in the United States, you got to watch out what you say. If you object to this, you can get a knock on your door from the police. You can get your bank account frozen, or you can get your social media accounts shut down. So you can't object, you can't complain, or you have to walk on eggshells and say the right euphemisms if you want to get away with it. And we're not living in Nazi Germany. We're living in the rules-based liberal world order. I don't know. I can't really tell much of the difference. And then, again, like what you're saying about these individual experiences. I said I didn't have profound friendships because I moved around a lot, but I have, in my moving around a lot, met people from all over and had really, really profound, and even in the brief time we knew each other, intense experiences where you kind of live a lifetime together in just a few weeks. I've met people from Pakistan. I've met people from Mauritania. I've met people from India, Korea, etc. And in fact, one of the gentlemen I met from Pakistan, we were both backpacking through Valencia, and he was just so passionately in love with Europe and dismayed at the trajectory Europe was taking with regards to everything we're talking about, and particularly the loss of Europeans' identity and the values. And so here's a man from Pakistan who's traveling around Europe, traveling around Spain, and he just loves everything he's seeing. And he's what you're describing, the class of person that's intellectual. He was well read. We had a great time speaking, and I was so thrilled to hear that he loved Europe so much. Okay, now that's great to have that experience, but it's a question of scale. He's one gentleman. If you were to import now overnight hundreds of thousands or millions of Pakistanis, well, I guess we're going to cross our fingers and hope that they have the same love of Europe and Spain and Valencia that he does, and that they all have the same intellectual personality and curious personality and respect for the host country that they're living or traveling in. I don't think it works that way. It's a question of scale, which is also why big bad white people back in the times you're talking about were averse to living with even upscale, upper class Black people. I think that in the years since the end of apartheid in South Africa or the end of segregation in America, I struggle to see how they haven't been proven right. You talk about failed states and how Germany under the National Socialists was this grim place. Well, what's South Africa post-apartheid? South Africa under apartheid had a world-famous airline. It had a functioning healthcare system. Sure, there was a door that said blacks here and whites here in the hospitals, but there were still hospitals. Now South Africa is borderline a failed state with one of the highest murder rates in the world. And I'm not just referring to the white farmer massacres. So, like I said, I don't have a hatred towards people with different skin color. I think that's the least relevant thing about racial differences is our complexion. And I don't even have a problem with necessarily other people's values. Like I said, I think Japan should be the place of Japanese people with Japanese values. Bushido, their strict, culture of responsibility and politeness and honor and all that. I think Russian culture should still be Russian and their values, even though I might disagree with them or not feel comfortable if I were to live in those places. Maybe I'd want to go back to a Western European country after having spent time in Japan or something like that. So it's not even a question of thinking my values are superior or my civilization is superior. It's all a question of, is this working? Is the scale appropriate? And then also, why is it morally wrong to not want to live with people who are of your kin? This has been one of the most important things. Like you mentioned, was it Plato who goes to Syracuse? So he didn't go to sub-Saharan Africa or the Far East. He went to a neighboring island. You know what I mean?
He went multiple places and he traveled, and actually he had been to Egypt as well. Plato was not a racist, and he did not look at people based upon.
I'm not saying he was. I'm just saying that to go from Athens to Syracuse, which was Greek populated, and Southern Italians to this day have a very high Greek ancestry, is not that big of a difference. But he finds someone from the beauty, and that's what I love. See, I love ancient Greece because unlike today, there was such political diversity. You had all these different Greek city-states, and they, in many cases, were all doing things their own way. Whether you had the sort of militaristic Spartan quasi-dictatorship, or you had Athenian democracy, or you had a tyrant over in Thebes. And no one said, we're going to go to war. The Athenians didn't say, we're going to go to war and give them democracy.
Oftentimes they did.
Not because of their form of government.
No, that was the reason. Like Sparta helped overthrow democracy and establish the 30 tyrants because they thought they would be more favorable to Spartan policies. And Athens would do similar things. In fact, Athens had an empire called the so-called Delian League, where really it allowed them to sort of control other city-states. So this sort of stuff was happening frequently, and they did look with judgment on governments that were not keeping a pace of the sort of democratic tide. Once Athens,
but you just said it was for their benefit, whereas today we're told that we're bombing the Iraqis, but it's to give them democracy. Like it's a humanitarian authoritarian thing. Like you
That's
just, the Athenians were doing it to benefit the Athenian state.
well,
Even
also
take
Alexander the
or
yeah, Alexander the Great made it his personal mission and destiny to spread Hellenization all over the world. And he thought we are benefiting people because we're spreading Greek culture. And actually, Aeschines, I believe it was
okay, but
Aeschines.
both things can be true at the same time. Alexander was someone who had a quest, a mission to do this, but uh, on the times where that wasn't happening, you did have a diversity of political systems in Greek city-states, and it wasn't a casus belli to go and invade them because they weren't doing it the right way. Whereas now, especially in the post-war world, we have seen invasion after invasion, predominantly from the liberal West, aka the American hegemony, of invading countries to change their way of doing things. I mean,
But
we had American feminists teaching Afghan women about critical theory and feminism in Afghanistan. Actually, I don't mind if Afghans want to do things their way. I don't mind. You might object. We might say, yeah, it's maybe it'd be better if they had iPhones and women could drive. Okay, perhaps. But I don't mind if they're doing it another way. It's not my concern, and I'm not going to say that it's worth invading their country over, which is actually just a lie, a smokescreen for the real reasons why these invasions happen anyway.
but
Which is
Angelo, one
go ahead.
thing, this is not new. Everything that you mentioned has been happening for thousands of years. Even in Mesopotamia, various city states would invade other city states, and they would come up with all kinds of reasons. And yes, the Greeks did do that, and the Romans did it, and the Romans claimed that they were civilizing these other nations. And so this is not new. And the Catholic Church did it, and the Protestants did it, and this is just something
Right,
that's
which
a part
we've
of
already talked
European
about, and
culture.
we
Yeah,
agreed on, and we already talked about. What I'm saying is, it's not a moral wrong for people to organize in a certain way and on certain foundational pillars given to us by Herodotus, one of which was shared blood. It's not wrong to say that a nation is your extended family, and it's not a moral failure or wrong to say that this worked, this has been working well, and we'd like it to continue despite your you know quasi-religious visions of a world where everyone's being brought together, and it seems to be physically in this temporal plane we're being brought together. But if several millions of people are objecting to that, don't you think that their objections should be taken into account?
but okay, but Angelo, it hasn't been working well. It hasn't been working well for a long time. Like even
What hasn't been
before.
working well?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. When you say it's been working well, what are you referring to? Because I can't think of a single period pre migrations where things were working well. Are you talking about Thatcherite England? Are you talking about post war Italy? What period, in what period were things working well? And also, you're presenting the Italians as, sorry, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you're presenting the Italians as this like genetically homogenous group. They've never been genetically homogenous. That's why there's all these different skin
There
colors.
are there are peoples living in the hills of Umbria whose genetic ancestry has been unchanged since the pre-Roman times.
Yeah,
There
them.
are the people living in England have been living there longer than the Maori have been in New Zealand. Yet everyone knows that the Maori are the indigenous people and they have indigenous people's rights. Yet the English don't when they've been
No,
there longer.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we can all point to various little subgroups within the larger group, but England's been invaded multiple times by different groups. Maybe they were white, but it's been invaded multiple times, and there were ethnic clashes. The Normans were different from the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who were different from the Britons, who were different from the Celts.
Yes.
Okay, so
It's just more examples of different people coming into conflict.
right. So I know. So that's just the way of the world, and you're trying to
So why
make it
would you do
sound
it
like
artificially?
So it's not artificial. It's the same thing. You're trying to make it sound like this is new. It's never been new.
But
And in
you're trying to
Italy,
make it sound like it's good.
no, well, it's how we got to where we are. Like if just going back to Italy, there are. I'm sure there are some hill people who have had an unchanged life, just like maybe the Appalachians here in America. But there were also Moors and Greeks and all these different types of
Invaders.
people. Huh?
But you're listing invaders. The Moors in Iberia were invaders.
Everybody's an invader. Europeans were invaders. They didn't start out where they are. They came from
And I'm meant
somewhere
to
else.
feel guilty about it. But
No,
when it comes to the European history of being invaded, well, now I'm supposed to say that that was the golden age of Spain when they were under Arab subjugation. The Ottoman Turks brought civilization to the Balkans and Greece and Anatolia. And wait a second, no, those are Europeans being the victims of conquests. But I'm supposed to celebrate the exchange of culture while they were being enslaved and kidnapped and butchered. And then there's all these wars to expel them. There's a 700-year Reconquista. There's the multiple wars against the Turks. There's the Crusades. I mean, what you saying that I'm saying this is something new, which we agreed on last time. This is new. This is unprecedented. The
what?
scale of population movements, the scale of the immigration, the technology that unites us globally, in particular the internet and other mass media, all of these things are not new in and of themselves, but they are unprecedented at the scale that they are now taking place.
But that's true not because of politics or race. That has to do with the increase in population due to the impact of industrialization. The Industrial Revolution changed everything in
Mm-hmm.
terms of scale, but the act itself, that is not new. There are more people on planet Earth as a result of
Okay.
industrialization. So then your main issue is the industrialized world. It's
No.
not.
Well, I do have issues with the industrialized world. A lot of what I have issues with, I've already lost the battle. I clearly I would say not even begrudgingly, I just admit it. It's the burden we must bear. But it's funny, this is, I'm sure many conservationists and ecologists have these same feelings when they see, the Amazon rainforest being torn down. Now, you might say that is just, it's happening. It's inevitable. And we need to do it to make more land for cattle to feed populations that are growing. But it's still sad and objectively, uh, I would say dangerous, perhaps, the unintended consequences or the side effects of cutting down huge swathes of the Amazon. And also, I never hear this argument when, like, people don't ever say, "Oh, just stop fighting the gun control battle." In America, Americans have loads of guns; they always will, and you can't do anything. I never hear anyone say, Greta Thunberg, stop caring about climate change. It's just going to happen. Don't worry about it. But people like me are told, stop caring about your people, stop caring about your community, your neighborhood, stop caring about your nation, and just accept that mass migration is going to change it, probably forever, and in extremely negative ways.
But Angela, aren't your people Americans?
No,
But you were
no.
born here.
But I don't believe in magic soil. Where I was born doesn't matter.
Yeah, but
Being born in a hospital in the Midwest did not imbibe me with some magic ethereal spell, just as the same way that it doesn't when an African is born in a hospital in Manchester.
yeah,
It
but
doesn't Mancunian.
yeah, but it does though, because even now there's kind of a cultural divide between African Americans and Africans because we come from two different trajectories, and the stuff that you're saying, a lot of that comes from America. Okay, that you sound like the nativists at the turn of the 20th century.
They
That's
were right.
huh?
The,
I know,
the
but
natives at the turn of the 20th century had legitimate concerns that were proven right. The Irish did change America. They
right,
were
so
right.
you're an American exporting your Americanism to
No,
Europe.
no. America is exporting a multiracial society and all of the problems therein to Europe, and Europeans are now forming the identitarian movement in response to it. Before that, Europeans had their own squabbles amongst themselves. We never had to deal with, on the European continent, the type of Brazilification or Americanification of our provinces, regions, villages, hamlets, towns, and capitals. Now it is happening all across the continent. It's even now seeping into the last holdouts in Eastern Europe, like Poland and eventually Hungary. Hungary is going to be punished for being the last holdout. That's constantly spoken about, the things that, the sanctions that must be done to Orban's Hungary for not accepting such and such migrant quotas and whatnot. So it's not an Americanization. In fact, oftentimes I had to play the role of the prophet from the, like, an alien from the future, telling Europeans that if you keep these policies going, you will end up like America, not in the sense that you're saying of, oh, it's the nativist. No, they are copying the American multiracial model. We now have, just as you do in America, like the terms aren't the same, but you have in France, in Germany, in Nordic countries now, you have all of these new populations forming caucuses, forming blocks, forming what would you call it? Like, I guess not, is the NAACP an NGO or like an activist group, but they're expressly interested in the interests of their group, their demographic. Whereas before, it was just Swedes having democratic debates over what's best for Sweden. Now they have to take into account the Syrian population, the African population, the Pakistani population, the Muslim population. Oh, and at the same time, this has to work with progressive gay rights, feminism. Like, these are not mixing well. In Dearborn, Michigan, I think it was, the hilarious story out of Dearborn, Michigan, where now that it's a Muslim majority, and now that there's even, I think, Muslims in power in like the local government, and one of the first things they did was make a little law saying that they're gonna not celebrate gay pride, or they were gonna take down or not put up pride flags a certain year, and the liberals felt betrayed. They're like, well, we helped you get here, and we embraced you, and we welcomed you, and we integrated you into the political miasma so that you could get your foot in the door and become politicians and local leaders of the community. And now they felt so betrayed. Well, because it turns out conservative Muslims aren't very keen on the gay stuff. Did no one not see this coming?
Well, something similar is in America with Hispanic populations, many of whom were voting for Trump. But I just want to say this, to go back to the point about you and what I see as actually your Americanism. There in America, because we are an ideological state and we're not a nation state to say like other countries are, there has always been a very ephemeral concept of identity, something that we've had to chase, and it happens in the Black and white communities. And so when I look at you and I hear everything that you're saying, I can't help but see the white equivalent of like the Black person who spent their whole life in America, was born and bred here, who's now putting on a dashiki, and who is keeping Kwanzaa, and who is connecting with their Africanness and talking about African consciousness, and ignoring the fact that their view of what it means to be an African, just like your view of what it means to be a European, is an American construction that is born out of displacement. And just how sometimes...
I already told you about people who kiss the ground because it's where they've always been from. They feel so connected to it. I can also talk about Irish people who are the same way, that you can tell who's from where because their accent is different. There's a twang, so you know that this one's from Cork, but this one's from Kerry. It's not me imposing American racism on little European hobbits. The Europeans already had these distinctions for centuries, and now they're simply having to adapt to the Americanization of the world and all of its latent racial discombobulation.
I know, brother, but listen, I've had conversations with Europeans in other countries, and they're on the right, and I'll ask them, where did you learn this stuff? And they start citing all of these American influencers.
Mm.
Americanism is being uh, uh, transplanted from the left and the right. You've got left wing version of it, and you've got right wing
Hmm.
version of it.
I
And
can
so
agree
what's
with that. Yeah.
happening,
Yeah.
a lot of what is good in the world is coming out of America. If it's the search for justice and equality and inalienable rights, America's greatest contribution to world culture is the practical application of the doctrine of inalienable rights. But there are also these other ideologies that are proving destructive, that are, and they're coming from the left and the right, and they're both problematic. And Angela, you can't have it both ways. You can't get mad at identity politics when it's somebody who's not white, but then you're doing
Oh,
this
I don't.
exact same.
Don't mistake me for
Okay.
a populist neocon holdover. I'm all for identity politics. All politics is identity politics when you boil it down. Whether you're being politically active for a working class, labor union fighting for a 5-day work week, higher salaries, safer working conditions, you're doing that because your identity is as a working class laborer, and that's what motivates you. If it's what we typically associate it with, ethnic or racially based. If you're black, here's the thing. Again, and again, these are the things that come with the multiracial society. No one in a 99% Irish Ireland, or a 99% English England, or a 99% Swedish Sweden ever had to care about the racial makeup of the cast of their sitcoms, or the cast of actors to reinterpret or portray an adaptation of a Sherlock Holmes novel. Now they do. But here's the thing. Since we now have these multiracial societies, I can actually sympathize with a black kid who is born and is growing up in Denmark, Sweden, England, France, and all he ever sees are white actors, white, because that's where he's born. That's the milieu that he's in. So all the actors on television, all the newsreaders, all the presenters, all the superheroes, they're white. And then, probably with good intentions, actually, here comes some progressives playing identity politics, and they say, why don't we make Spider-Man black? Or why don't we make the actor who plays Felix Leiter in the James Bond films, we'll make him black. And there was a funny joke back when the BBC. It's incredible that this was done on the BBC. There's this old video of a BBC film reviewer, kind of tongue in cheek. I guess he would do tongue in cheek reviews, and he reviews one of the first film where Felix Leiter, James Bond's like American CIA sidekick, is played by a black actor, and the English BBC presenter says, "Oh, I guess they should have called him Felix Darker." I can't imagine living in a world where you could get away with saying that on the BBC, because we have to watch what you say now, especially in dear old Blighty, and also that sort of tongue-in-cheek humor when it was understood that the English were the undisputed majority, and English culture and English ways of doing things was undisputed. You could tolerate not just a tongue-in-cheek joke about the black guy being cast to play James Bond's CIA sidekick, but you could also tolerate a black or Asian minority footballer on the England national team. There was one or two back in the 90s and the late 80s. You could tolerate a black MP from the Caribbean, a descendant of Windrush. When it was, again, it's a question of scale. When it was just one or two, but everyone understood the English are still the majority, the undisputed majority in their English homeland. It was fine. We all that's what I mean to say when it was working. That's what I mean. But just to finish the point about identity politics, I can sympathize with someone saying, man, I just wish that one of these superheroes was black. I can sympathize with the black kid thinking that, or with an older, an adolescent, or a more intellectual adult black person thinking that, and then being an activist for that, and wanting that, pursuing that. That's why I don't think identity politics is something bad. The people like Ben Shapiro, who made criticizing identity politics so popular on the right, or at least the conservatives of America, I despise him because he's clearly an identitarian for Israel and Jewish identity,
I
but I don't
agree.
judge him that. Oh, be as pro-identitarian Israeli and Jew as you want. It has served them bloody well, hasn't it?
No,
It hasn't? Oh, okay.
no,
I'd
that's
have to
what I
hear your
was.
take on that.
The last time we talked, you said the nation state makes people safe. Tell that to the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who got shot by a nationalist. Tell that Israelis are surrounded by a bunch of people
But
who
wait,
hate. Huh?
but he was shot because of a nationalist wanting to be free from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was an
Right.
imperialist oppressor. But so that's a strange example when I can point to the millions of Jews who live in Israel who will never be Holocausted because now
That
they have a nation state with an army and technology, and that nation state is equal in the eyes of the United Nations and all the other institutions that we have on this world to guarantee the safety and preservation of peoples. When they
Israel
didn't
is
have a nation state, they could be put into camps.
they're not safe. They're actually more in danger. And that's what I'm saying. Nationalism breeds violence. Okay. Nationalism invariably turns into National Socialism, which is the most violent kind of society that you can have. Israel is in a very precarious situation because, amongst all of the new states, which are mostly ideological in nature, Israel stands out because, again, it is an ethno state. And people are like, wait, why do you get to have that and we don't? So they're not safe.
I do
October.
agree with that. I've theorized about this. People are saying that woke has been put away, and one of the reasons that woke had to be put away was because how do you motivate red-blooded white American males to fight wars for Israel, to safeguard Israel? So we gotta put the rainbow flags, the trans flags, the generals dressed in skirts. We got to get rid of all this stuff because recruitment is down, and we have to have Israel's back 24/7, unconditionally, forever. So put the woke away, and people can point to lots of examples to back up that claim. But I was noticing something else, and I put it out there in a Substack article and various Twitter posts, which is that woke is still alive and well, and it could very well put Israel away for the reasons you just mentioned. If we are having this new way of doing things, this washing away of the Aquarian age, and we're going to have multicultural or multiracial societies, you can't have this one state protected by walls, segregated, highly nationalistic, and exclusionary. You can't have this one state in the Middle East getting away with genocide, basically. No, that state's going to have to go too.
Right.
And even though Israel is powerful and has an extremely influential lobby, especially in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., I don't know if they would be able to withstand the entire world saying, hey, you got to get on board.
They can't. They can't. And this is why I'm telling you, if you get your dream and there is a massive ethnic purge and there's cleansing and you're getting rid of all these undesirables from your point of view and making these all white majority
Hold on,
countries.
you're misrepresenting me. I'm not talking about ethnic cleansing. Remigration is just sending people back where they came from 5 years ago,
That's
2 years
ethnic
ago,
cleansing
last
though.
year.
Angelo, but that's ethnic cleansing because you're kicking them out because of their ethnicity. These aren't necessarily criminals. If you're trying to get rid of criminals, that's one thing. But
Okay, well then where were the human rights of the native peoples? This is so hypocritical to say that the human rights of the people who came here at the behest of global capital or ideologues with this weird vision, that matters but the human rights of the native populations, of these working class peoples whose towns have been transformed, who are now living with rape gangs, grooming gangs, unsafe metros, unsafe streets, women being harassed all the time. Their rights don't matter, and we just have to live with this forever. When does this
That's
get better?
that's a different argument, though.
It's all
That.
the same. It's
Why do
all
you?
connected.
Okay, let me say this to you. I think it's important. You can talk about things and based on numbers and figures that you've read and stories you've heard, but I think it's important to make it a personal thing. So the reason why I believe strongly in the current ideological state of equality and inalienable rights and things of that nature, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is because of my family's history. So when you're talking about Black culture and you people on the dissident right are attacking people and calling us all ghetto and all this stuff, that doesn't resonate for me. And let me tell you why. Going back to that period of the Great Migrations, it didn't turn out great for Black people in Chicago. Well, my grandparents, starting in 1950, they left Louisiana and they moved to California. Why? There was a beacon of hope there. My grandmother had an aunt. She was a Black woman. She was wealthy. She lived in a decent suburb. She attended a racially integrated church. It was mostly white, but there were other groups that went there. And she had made money. I don't know how, but after the Great Depression, she became very wealthy. Well, my grandmother looked at her example, and so she gathered her few belongings and she traveled to California, and she moved into a predominantly Black neighborhood, and she started out like cleaning homes, and she would clean the homes of the wealthy. My grandpa, he worked at an Air Force base, and they raised kids, but she always had a dream that she wanted more for herself. And so she winds up going to college, and eventually she starts a business where she's taking care of developmentally disabled people. And at the time, there was such a need for it that the government was willing to pay a lot of money for people who created these facilities. And so, even though when she started out, she was in a more or less ethnically homogenous community, by the time I was born, this Black woman from the South, who, by the way, had to sue the loan company for racial discrimination because they wouldn't give her a loan to build a larger structure, by the time I came into being, I saw the fruits of a years-long struggle for dignity and self-worth. And I wasn't driving to that ethnically homogenous neighborhood. I was driving to her country estate, a 5,000 square foot home that in a predominantly white community, that a house that my mother had helped to design. And so for me, my introduction to the African American community was prosperity and believing that you could be whatever you want to be if you don't give up and if you fight for what you believe in. And I'm not going to say she's the dominant example, but everybody respected her in the community. I think before there was a fire that burned down her property after she passed, but I remember there was a picture of her with the then governor of California, I believe, if that's what I remember seeing. And the reason that people respected her is because she was a lady. She was a grande dame, and she sent all of her kids to boarding school, and so she succeeded in a society that had nationalistic elements, but had this countervailing tradition of no, we're all equal under the eyes of the law, and if this is what you want to do and you're willing to work for it, you can succeed. Now, for my own part, and this is the question I have to ask for you, it's one thing to sit around, and I'm not saying this is what you're doing because I don't know that much about your life, attacking Blacks and attacking Mexicans and attacking Pakistanis and attacking all these people, but how much of a force for positivity and good are you being in the world? Now, for me, I work as a teacher. I live in a community that's mostly white. A lot of the poor people here are white. And one of the things that I've noticed is that because they are poor and white, is they really like rap music. It's not because the musicians are black. It's because there's something about rap music and hip hop culture that speaks to them as poor people, because that's how it started. It was for poor people in these ghettos who wanted to do something artistic and creative versus fighting amongst gangs. So they would have block parties and there were MCs and all this stuff. And the original rap was very different from the gangster rap that showed up once the algorithm of these record labels determined, hey, why don't you sell the most extreme version of inner city violence to these white kids who are very privileged going up, who want some excitement in their lives. So coming back to the present, every single summer I go into the juvenile hall of my own accord. I volunteer. I want to do this. I get paid, of course, but I don't have to do it. I want to do it because I enjoy it. And I teach these students, mostly white, and they like rap, they like gangster stuff and all that. But what I do is I hold a poetry recital, and we study Shakespeare, and we study W.B. Yeats, and we study Paul Laurence Dunbar, and all of these masterpieces of the English language. And I get these kids who come from backgrounds that you could scarcely imagine, the totally underprivileged, to step out of their comfort zone and recite these poems in front of an audience that is bigger than any audience that they've ever been in front of. And it works every single time. And the reason for that is because there's two reasons. A, no matter what their crimes are, they could be murderers, and there are some. They could be sexual SA people. They could be thieves, burglars, whatever. I don't judge them, because my goal is not to force them deeper into the muck that they're already living in, because they come from families where they've been neglected and abused and have had all this trauma. My goal is transformation, and the only way that I can do that is to believe in them. And people look, when I first started the recital, people in the hall would be like, I can't believe you're able to get them to do this. Why? The reason why is because I bring into that atmosphere the kind of culture that I want to see. I am the change. It's me. It's not governments that are going to do it. It's none of these people. It's me, and it's people like me who are visionaries who want to see a change in the world. And that is why I could go anywhere. So this past summer, I was in, the summer before, I was in England. And I met this kid from America. He was a student at Yale. And he said he wanted to become a history teacher, but he was stressed out because he was like, I've seen that movie, The Dead Poets Society, and I want that kind of an experience. He's like, I'm afraid, should I do private schools or should I do public schools? I told him I'm going to have a Dead Poets Society experience in a few weeks when I go back home and I teach at the juvenile hall. I said, we're going to be learning Shakespeare. We're going to be learning Walt Whitman. We're going to be learning all of these various poets that you want to teach. And I said, because the culture of the Dead Poets Society is already inside of me. I can go to a madras in North Africa. I can go to a school in Siberia. I could go to a prison in Japan or an inner city school in Ireland. It doesn't matter, because it's inside of me, because I'm committed to being a force for change in the world. I'm not trying to tear people down. I'm not pointing out everything that's wrong with you in order to feel superior and justify my hatred. I'm not doing that, because I'm coming from a place of love. And
sorry, go ahead.
And that is why I'm starting the Cerugian Society. It's because men are really messed up in the head. And it's because we live in a society that has forged a Faustian bargain that says material affluence is worth the cost of a life with meaning and purpose, and feeling accepted and socially integrated. And so we got a lot of guys out here who go into society. They're like, I got to get rich. I got to make all this money. And many of them have no friends. Ben Shapiro had no friends. He's rich. He still doesn't have any friends. The people I think he has friends, these are just business partners, like his erstwhile CEO, Jeremy Boring. That's what he has. And he even said, when people want to be my friend, I always think, how much money is this going to cost me? Like, if to hang out with you, I could be making money.
Yeah.
He is a product of the system. But for me, when I was a kid, I always had this feeling. I love my natural family. I love my parents, brothers, sister, love them. But I always had this feeling that I had a spiritual family somewhere, and I didn't know them, but I yearned for them. And I knew that if I was going to meet them, join them, I would have to find them. I would have to seek them out. I would have to create a space where they could come. People who shared my interests, who loved knowledge, loved wisdom, who enjoyed culture. I love classical music. My grandmother loved classical music. I love African American music. I love blues, gospel music, R&B. I love it all. I love everything that is excellent. And I knew that there were people out there, Black, white, Asian, and Hispanic, who had my sensibilities and who wanted a space where we could appreciate, enjoy, and even create our own artifacts of cultural excellence. And the person that inspires a lot of my vision is Plato, because Plato did construct an academy. And the academy became the receptacle for Hellenic culture after the Hellenic age had passed. After the independent city-state, which gave birth to it, ended, and now they were in a hostile world, Greek culture was preserved through intentional communities like these philosophical schools. And so for me, when I look at individuals like you and I look at movements like MAGA and I look at Donald Trump, I think of the pagans in the Roman world who thought that the onset of Christianity was going to erase everything that was good, everything that was excellent in classical society, and that wasn't the case. Some people went so far as to try to reverse the trend. So, for example, Julian the Apostate,
my favorite Roman emperor,
who oh my goodness. Oh, I'm glad you won't be insulted when I compare you and Trump to him. 361, 363, he rebuilds all these temples and he tries to make paganism the faith again, and he travels to the Oracle of Delphi, and the Oracle gives out one last utterance, and it says, "Tell the king, the fair wrought house has fallen to the ground. Thebes has no chapel left, no prophesying bay, no talking spring. The stream is dry that had so much to say," meaning it's over. The era of classical pagan culture, civilization is gone. There is a new order that has come into being. And this order, in certain respects, would excel everything that had preceded it. Now, there are some things about
the conversion to Christianity within a century, Roman Empire had fallen. Why?
Yeah, but
because the Christian cult undid Roman unity. The Christian cult undid the Roman gens. The Christian cult subverted the Roman elite. It was the original woke movement of its time.
It didn't.
This is a huge topic, which will probably have to be some other discussion.
I know, but listen, brother, let me tell you something. That's not true. The Roman Empire had become incredibly corrupt, and I'm not talking about the Christians. I'm talking about pagan Rome had become a cesspool of corruption, and before Christianity even took over, Diocletian had to divide it into 4 different quadrants because he knew if he didn't, it was going to collapse. And in fact,
there was hardly ever a time where you could say that Rome wasn't corrupt.
Well, actually, under Marcus Aurelius, it wasn't that bad. And actually, under Octavian,
he was a pagan.
Right. I'm saying, right. So as long as it was a morally fortified structure, they were doing okay. But that had gone away. They had gone the way of the Greeks. They had gone the way of the Athenians, and they had grown more and more corrupt, more and more greedy, more and more morally lax. And actually, Christianity brought a spiritual, moral shot in the arm that actually extended the kingdom longer than it otherwise would have been. Constantine reunited the kingdom under a Christian banner, and it actually lasted another hundred.
Constantine also boiled his wife to death.
Yeah, well,
Didn't he? I
he
mean,
was well. Wait,
I
when you
just
talk,
don't. I think you're giving a lot of importance to systems and not the individuals that live those systems or implement those systems. Like, what are the morals that Christianity had exclusive hold on that pre-Christian Romans or any other populations didn't have? I mean, the Hippocratic Oath, because you mentioned like human sacrifice and stuff like that before. The original Hippocratic Oath has an injunction against abortion, something I think Christians would be very happy to hear. But you always hear Christians going on about how, oh, we crushed those baby sacrificing, demon worshiping pagans and gave them morality. Well, wait a second. The original Hippocratic Oath has an injunction against killing unborn babies.
but not against exposure, not against exposing children.
Exposing children?
Yeah, you know how if there was an unwanted child, they would just leave it out in the
Oh,
forest
yeah.
and it would
Okay. Yeah. Like
die.
the Spartans throwing them off the cliff and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the Romans too, they would just leave it out in the wilderness
Mhm.
and it would die.
Yeah, but that happened. Again, you mentioned, some of the progress in women's rights. I mean, that happens into the Renaissance. Vivaldi was an abandoned child, was left to that, and that's in Christian Italy, Christian Venice. So again, these things just it's about it. There are people behind these things. I just this is why I don't like taboos on systems, whether it's governance or religion. I think that you can have a thriving, functioning dictatorship if the dictator is a philosopher king and moral and does what is best for the people who are in his charge. You can
That's
have a thriving, functioning democracy. You can have a corrupt dictatorship and a corrupt democracy if you have corrupt people in the positions of power. It's not that one is inherently better than, and this is also an ancient Greek belief. Who was the philosopher who came up with the cyclical history? The Greek philosopher who had the cyclical history, and hold on, let me check. Well,
are you
there
talking
was
about Plato?
I'm not sure if it was Plato. It was someone. It might have been. It's someone else with a longer name. But there was a Greek historian philosopher who basically summarized that civilizations go through cycles, and there's basically like a golden age.
Hesiod.
Perhaps it's Hesiod is the one with the ages that kind of correspond to even the Vedic Kali yugas and things like that. But there was one in particular who essentially he posited that there is no form of government that is inherently superior to another. It's the men who are the government that determines whether it's good governance or not good. It's so again, this goes back to the political diversity of the ancient time, and so he was saying, and then his cyclical thing basically was that you have a sort of warrior class that with their masculinity and their vril, their drive, they conquest, they conquer, and they are the first to set up the society, the governance. And because they have a vision and a quest, and they're full of this life-consuming energy, they are basically princeps. They are the best, the most ideal. But every subsequent generation is decreasing in value. And from that warrior elite aristocracy, it descends to eventually, like you have factions now who are wanting to have more power. So you have a competing aristocracy that becomes an oligarchy that descends to a tyranny. Then the tyranny descends into, then because the people are upset with the tyrant, they want democracy too much democracy, then or too corrosive democracy descends into mob rule, and then the cycle goes back to the warrior aristocracy.
I think you're talking about Plato's Republic, and the fact of the matter is, the first government he talked about was an aristocracy, which is based upon philosophy, and it deals with wisdom. The warrior aristocracy, which is a timarchy or timocracy, that comes afterward, and that the reason why the first one is called an aristocracy is because they are in touch with these kind of eternal truths that philosophy purports to study, and money and property ownership have been taken out of government. So they don't have the kind of corrupt governments that we have, where money and government work hand in hand, unfortunately. And so the reason why, no, Plato doesn't believe that governments are all equal. He thinks that each of these is getting worse and worse and worse. And when you say you could have a dictator who's also a philosopher king, no, because a philosopher would not consent to rule over an authoritarian society because he knows better, he or she knows better. And so it's all governments, all systems are not equal. I just want to say, I haven't heard a whole. You didn't really share your experience. You talked about how you were born here and then you left because you wanted to escape multiculturalism, which for me is kind of an extreme decision to make, just because you didn't. Like, to me, we've always been multicultural. So, but I will say this.
No, we haven't. Look, I grew up experiencing anti-white racism, and I lived in the third most dangerous place in the entire country because of racially violent ghettos, and the violence spilled out everywhere. There were no go zones. We didn't have that term back then. And I am a son of a fresh off the boat Italian migrant. My Italian family would visit me. They don't speak any English. We, when we could afford it, would go to Italy and visit them. I speak Italian. I spoke Italian to my Italian family. It was a significant part of my upbringing, my identity, which made me stand out amongst the farm boys and girls of the Midwest, or the white trash, or the gangbanger blacks and cholos. And I also liked the aesthetics of Italy and Europe, and these hamlets and villages and towns and magnificent capitals. And so, as my birthright, I got Italian citizenship and moved to Italy the moment I could, which was basically upon turning 18 and being a legal adult. And then for my entire adult life, I've watched it all be uglified and eroded as it's been Americanized.
Right.
It's exactly what I lived in America.
So can I ask you a question? What price are you willing? What cost? How high is the cost to get what you want? What price are you willing to pay in order to get your ideal society, this homogenized society, where
that's such an interesting question, because what's so funny, and you said, I think you don't. It's funny that you reached out to me, because I don't think you know much about who I am or what I believe at all, but it's all out there. And my Substack is out there. And one of the most recent pieces I wrote was my firsthand account of attending the Remigration Summit in Italy, near Milan. And what's so interesting about something like the Remigration Summit and all the speakers who went there and all the people who attended is how concerned they, or we, I will include myself amongst them, how concerned we all are about doing this morally, doing this justly. And yet we are constantly smeared as somehow the second coming of Hitler.
I don't think that, by the way.
But, and the questions that were posed to me, I write about them. There was such a media frenzy. I've never seen anything like it. Obviously, I'm just a normal guy, so of course I've never seen so many film cameras pointed at me and journalists sticking a microphone at my face. But there was such a media hubbub about this conference, and the local media and national media descended upon it to, film our faces and who are these deplorables, I guess, that are attending this conference, and maybe we can get a few sound bites from them. So I was actually stopped by one of these reporters, and he wanted to ask me a few questions, and I consented. But the questions he was asking me are kind of similar to yours. He asked questions like, why don't you just want people to live together and get along? And I was like, what do you mean? What? Integrating. Okay, well, what does that mean, integrating? You've imported, for example, a bunch of North African and Middle Eastern Arab Muslims. What does integration mean? Are you going to require that they give up their religion and convert to Roman Catholicism? Oh, no, you've never meant that. And if you did, then you would completely undermine the claim of diversity, because you can't have integration and diversity simultaneously. They counteract.
But
Go
that's
ahead.
not my question for you though. My question was, what price are you willing to pay to have a racially and ethnically homogenized
What
Italy?
is the price? What is the price of going to the way that things were before the basically 2015? Do you realize that the vast majority of migrants in a country like the United Kingdom, this is government statistics, the majority of them have come in the last 10 to 12 years?
Okay.
Okay, we're not having to go back to, people, especially in America, always mention the 1950s because that was America's golden age. But if you lived in a different country, the 1950s isn't a reference point. But we don't even, and this is the thing. This is why you mentioned, and you said that not me specifically, but people who are always attacking blacks or Hispanics or whatever. I don't really care about what's going on in America anymore. As much as I can, I try to avoid exposure to the American circus. And I understand that there is a lot of racial tension in America because it's so racially diverse. And I also understand why someone like you would want a um, an ideological state, a philosopher state, and I understand why it's beneficial for you. And I agree that in a multiracial state there should be equal rights for all of the different peoples under the law to the best of human ability. Of course, and it makes sense that you would want that. What I'm saying is I don't want multiracial societies to begin with, and we can just skip all of the problems about who's equal under which law, and am I going to have people throwing stones in my business's windows if I set up a shop in this neighborhood? Will they accept me? We don't have to, and none of this would be happening. It's not organically happening. This isn't the same as the age of migration after the Roman Empire or the movements of the Sea Peoples. There are huge interest behind this, government policies, laws signed by heads of state, and a vast network of NGOs making this happen. African migrants are flown into Spain on Iberia Island Airlines and just dumped in the Canary Islands. Or then they're flown from the Canary Islands into Barajas, Madrid airport at night under cover of darkness. And if a Spanish citizen films them on his phone, suddenly someone comes out of nowhere and says, no, you stop filming. Why can't I film? I'm a Spaniard on Spanish territory filming what's going on in my country. Why can't? No, stop filming, says someone wearing a high-vis vest with some kind of badge of authority on it. What's going on here? So I don't see it as a price to pay to say, stop doing that. Please
I
stop doing that.
Okay, but it's happening now. These people are there. So like you said, you don't
Well, they
want
can get put back on an Iberian Airlines flight back to where they came from.
okay, so
And
you're massive kicking these people no matter how much it affects your country or how much it affects the people. So for example, if there are people from these nations who aren't Muslims, they've embraced the Italian way of life, they speak Italian, they have Italian friends, maybe an Italian wife or husband, mixed children, things like that. You don't care. You're willing to kick them out.
I'm willing to do that if it's part of the process of bringing the demographic sanity and I mean that in the Latin sense of the word, coming from health, not just not being crazy, of these places, why do I have to care more about the feelings of a Filipino family who came to Italy and learned Italian, and now their kids playing, calcio on Sundays with his Italian mates? But no one ever seems to care about the Italian kid who's the minority Italian. He's the only one Italian in his school.
I do.
Okay, well then how do you solve the problem of schools where there's only one Italian student, or schools in France where there's only one French student, or schools in Ireland where there's only one Irish student? I mean, the Irish fought for hundreds of years for an independent Gaelic nation state, and within a few decades of liberalism and open borders and empathetic immigration or economic immigration, which is a lie, like I already said, it doesn't work. Within a few years of that, the Irish are on course to be a minority.
Right.
You mentioned W.B. Yeats as one of the poets that you give to these juvenile inmates. Yeats was an Irish nationalist.
Right.
Yeats took the power. This is something that I've talked about. That the dissident right, the alt-right, whatever, the nationalist right, is really failing at. Although it's hard because so many of the channels are blocked off, the avenues are blocked off to us. But we've really failed on the artistic, creative front. Yeats used the power of poetry, just as so many nationalist artists, painters, used the power of their paintings or the power of their poetry or Irish folk music, and again, going into the Irish context, to inspire the nationalist movements, which were also anti-imperialist. Like, this is why it's so funny when people associate nationalism with being on the far right. So many of nationalist movements were actually leftist in nature.
Can I answer your question? Why do I teach him? So let me just remind you, W.B. Yeats was also into witchcraft and part of the occult, which I'm not on board with. I don't practice witchcraft. The reason I teach the poem "The Second Coming" is because it is
a great poem.
It is an excellent piece of literary art.
It's a great poem.
And I think that it's one of my favorites. And I don't care about his, in my view, flaws. I focus on the art.
But wait a second.
You
don't think that the Irish deserve to be free of the British yoke and have an independent nation state?
That's the other thing. You said, what is their destiny? Well, you're telling me I'm kind of, as a globalist, kind of deciding the destiny. But in a way, Pox, you don't get to decide their destiny because there are a lot of Irish people who don't agree with you. And the fact of the matter is, it's not my business, the squabbles between the English and the Irish. That's none of my business, okay? But what I will say is this. I'm more concerned with man's character, with his interior. So for me, the answer to what you're talking about is, I will say this. The nation state and the nationalist mentality that sort of continue to cling to it are not working, and it's creating problems. So the answer is the global state. And the global state does not mean a dictatorial society. It means a movement of, it's a confederation of peoples all over the world deciding this is the new moral order, this is what is acceptable, this is what is not acceptable.
Okay, but why does that require population shifts and changes?
Well, the population shifts have to do with governments. That has nothing to do with global state. That has to do with governments trying to save their nations from economic collapse. And I know
but I just showed you that earlier. If you we've been going for quite long. I provided data that shows that it's not. If that's the purpose, it's failed.
Well, but Angelo, there's other data that does not support what you're saying. You've pulled out a few lone individuals, but there are scores of economists who say this is what will happen if we do not have a steady stream of immigrants to replace an aging native population. I know you don't believe it. That maybe we just
won't see. That just sounds like an economic model that needs revision.
That's what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is we need to get rid of. In part of the nation state, you have unplanned towns, unplanned cities, unplanned communities. My thing is we need to get into the intentional community movement, which is a form of the intentional of the ideological state, but it's on a smaller basis. And it's people who align based upon shared values, shared uh,
But what are those
cult.
values going to be? Because I hear this all the
Well,
time. For
yeah.
example,
Mhm.
British values or American values. Apparently, British values are just queuing and eating fish and chips. American values are watching NFL and, I don't know, democracy. Okay. Like, here's the thing: you love classical philosophy, classical music. You also love blues music and African American music and that sort of thing. Can these things be created without those people first? Like, if you fill Ireland with a bunch of non-Irish people, I love Irish culture. My mother's side's Irish. I love Irish culture. I love being in Ireland. I have some of the people I mentioned earlier that you have these intense, brief friendships with were with Irish lads that I met in my travels or doing other jobs. Okay, always great crack, as they say. You can't get that though without Irish people, and if you dilute, yes, Irish culture with Pakistanis and Nigerians and Indians who take to the streets celebrating their Indian culture and their Pakistani culture and their Nigerian culture in their various parades and all that sort of thing. And they take over entire neighborhoods and cities. And then they're going to get into politics and form their blocs and caucuses and ask for more representation. I'm sorry, but you won't have Irish culture, or you'll have a synthetic simulacra of it. You can put a Nigerian in a leprechaun costume and give him an Irish fiddle and say, here, play some Celtic tunes, but it's fake.
No, Angelo, I'm sorry, that's not true. I understand what you're saying on some level. And listen, this is not a question of whether or not these peoples continue to exist, because they will. Personally, I've made some really good friends with people in England. Uh, they're English. I absolutely love and adore them. I think they're wonderful. And I've always loved English culture. But the idea that you can't have English culture somewhere else is not true. One of the things that I think it was Aeschines, don't quote me on that, but one of the things he says in his speech, in it's called Against Democracy, is he says, "We've reached a point where now to be Greek no longer means to even be born a Greek. It just means anybody who loves wisdom." Meaning, the culture itself had reached a stage of development that it went beyond the ethnicity, and it just became um, a way of approaching the world. And I agree with that. I think that uh, African American culture is like that. And that's why I run into so many white kids, and they talk more stereotypically black than I do. They dance better than I do. They can rap. I can't rap.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them can sing. They found something that resonated with them, and they adopted it. And I don't begrudge them at all. You want to be an honorary black person? Go for it. And there are a lot of people, black people like me, who absolutely love ancient Greece.
But you're still
And
acknowledging that the rap music that the white kids have adopted came from blacks. It
yeah, it
came from
did.
black people who then created a black culture, and they made something that was theirs, and now it's been diffused to other parts of society, other parts of the country, other parts of the world now. But it's still a particular creation of a particular people. There's an origin point that I don't think you're giving enough respect to.
Both can be true. Both can be true. I can acknowledge both. It's not an either or. It's a both. I look at Bonnie Raitt. She's one of the greatest blues guitarists, blues singers. She's white. Um, I look at Alexander Dumas. He had
Mm-hmm.
African. Had African ancestry, and yet he's one of the greatest
Mm-hmm.
Spanish writers ever. I look at
Again, it's the question of scale. It's the question of Alexander Dumas is one writer swimming in an ocean of French culture. And my point, which I think
French.
you agree with, is that the French culture is downstream from a thing called the French people. And yes, like a cake is made of flour, eggs, and sugar, the French people are made of Celts and Franks and a bit of the Gaul, and a lot of the Gauls and a bit of the Romans. But then over time, that's what becomes the Français, the French people. Okay. And now what's happening is just sort of willy-nilly in very short amount of time, we're saying, no, all of this is just meaningless social constructs. And it seems like you agree with the idea that culture or civilization is just something that you can consume or try on, like clothes. Whereas I think it's a bit more profound than that. And I don't like the shallowing of culture, where to be Irish is just to eat Tayto crisps and drink a Guinness, or to be English is to queue and watch Doctor Who. Because here's the thing, I don't think you're a utopianist. So I mean, you know that conflict will still exist.
Yeah.
And right now, we have people in the halls of Brussels always warning about war with Russia. Okay, and America. One of the reasons why America is so grotesquely, cartoonishly patriotic is because you have to promote constant 24-hour flag-waving patriotism to keep people believing in the American project and feeling proud of it, to get along and want to fight for it and work for it and pay taxes to it and all that stuff. Because once you don't have that, and especially if at the same time you're demonizing the native people, you're locking them up for objecting to whatever it is that you're trying to implement or change or redesign. But now that you want British men, French men, Italians, Spaniards to go fight Russia, but you've just spent the past 10 to 15 years slagging off their countries, slagging off their identity, undermining the national bonds. What are they fighting for exactly?
Well, how about this? What you're not talking about me, and you're not talking about Black people in America. You are talking about elites that belong to the Davos group who are making decisions, and most of them are unelected, that maybe people don't like. So here's the thing. This is my main issue with identity politics right now, is that if we continue to divide the great majority of people in the world, then we are prey to decision makers who are doing things against the general will, like, for example, COVID policy, and how an entire economy was shut down. And the only reason it was lifted is because the majority was getting tired of it. So for me, we've got to stop dividing each other and playing racial football and
I agree in the context of where you're coming from. But what I'm saying is the racial football wasn't being played in Ireland up until like 5 seconds ago. It wasn't being played in Italy. The racial football that was being played in Italy was nobody likes the Napolitani and the North doesn't like the South, but it was their own particular form of racism. But
why
now
is
you're
that
adding.
okay?
Sorry?
Why are you okay with that, but not at the extension of that?
I'm not okay with it. What I'm saying is there is already enough rivalries, prejudice, discrimination, exclusion, whatever words you want to say, which just naturally arise. People, it's like how Milan fans and Inter fans are rivals, but they're from the same city, but they have a thing that's theirs, it's distinct, and they compete, and they are rivals for a moment. And so every 2 times a year, there's a match between the two Milan teams, and they jokingly take the piss out of each other, even though they're both Milanese. Okay. So what I'm saying is that the racial football, I understand all of the things you're coming from in the American context, and I understand I can empathize with the history of Blacks in America. I've had conversations with white nationalists of the American scene I've said, come on, Like, because I will say, look, I understand that there was so there were some laws on the books before 1792 or 17 such and such about how America was going to be just a country for white men of good character, and until the Nationalization Act of 1792, only Europeans could be Americans. Well, from 1776 to 1792 is not that long. And if for the rest of American history, from 1792 to 2025, current year, the history of American citizenship laws has been broadening the net, well, that's the American tradition. And I asked, are you really saying that Michael Jordan is not an American? And the white nationalist said, of course he's not, right? And I'm like, dude, no one's going to take that seriously, man. And I'm sorry that that's the path America took for these white nationalists. I'm sorry. It's really hard for them to argue, and I understand that, that's why they have to say that we want a national divorce and all these things. The American history of racial populations and the blacks, and then not to mention the so-called Native Americans and all that, and then what used to be Mexico was much bigger, and so you've got the Hispanic population. Okay, it's a myriad history of population conflict. But in the European context, whether you're talking about Ireland, Nordic countries, Italy, it was intra. Okay, and if it's bad enough to have English versus Irish or Italian regional differences, if that's bad enough, why make it worse by now dumping a bunch of North African Arabs, Muslims, or Sub-Saharan Africans, or Indian Hindus, and saying, oh, good luck?
Can I ask you a question to go back to that Michael Jordan question? Because I need some clarification. You said it sucks that it's that way for the nationalists. Is what's problematic about that example the fact that no one will take the claim seriously that Michael Jordan is not an American? Or is it the claim that this man, who is a descendant of slaves who were forcibly brought over from Africa and worked the land and then were given citizenship, is that generations after that, group would say you're not an American after all that? What's the problem for you there?
It's both, because I don't think white nationalists are evil troglodytes, okay? And they have a point about, the origin of the United States project. For all of the Masonic values and Enlightenment values of the American founding fathers, yes, the wokeists are correct. Many of them were racist, and the black slaves were not granted citizenship and were not deemed Americans. But then you also have very early on, I think it was 1784, there's a letter by George Washington where he's already saying that the doors of the United States are open to Mohammedans, Jews, Chinamen. He's using these antiquated terms, so YouTube, don't censor me for saying Chinaman, but or Mohammedan. So George Washington is already giving us a foreshadowing of the American ethos of being open to all very early on. Why I say it's unfortunate from the white nationalist perspective is because they believe that America was and therefore always should be a country for white people, and by white people they mean descendants of Europe or from Europe. Now, because they're 250 years late to the party, they have to now deal with the world as it is and live in the present. So what are the solutions? Well, okay, do we have a national divorce? You've mentioned intentional, what are they called? Intentional communities?
Intentional communities that are based upon shared values and ideologies and not based upon race.
Well, there is someone who would say that it's both in his case. The Return to the Land is the name of their project.
I've heard of him, but I want to get to Eric Orwell in a second. I reached out to him. Yeah, I reached out to him too because To
Just to
me,
answer your
he
question, though, the reason, and so I understand, I empathize with their position, but I also have to just be realist and say, look, there's just no way that you can say, even by the standards of the American, your American ancestors, that Michael Jordan is not an American. Like he just is, okay? Because that's the path America took. It may not have started out as a propositional state. It may have started out as, an extension of Europe, or especially an extension of Britain. And that's why, it's a part of the Anglophone, it's part of the Anglosphere. Um, but again, very early on, the net to be considered an American was broadened. And eventually it came to include the blacks and the black slave descendants. And so now to say, no, America, in my mind, America is just it only means white. You're going to have to create a new America then for that to be the case, because the America that everyone knows in the present day as the real thing means that Michael Jordan is an American, even though he's black. It just is that way.
so just to make sure that we're clear, there were at least, I believe, two attempts prior to the one successful attempt that we celebrate on Thanksgiving Day in America for the English to carve out a colony in the United States, and they all failed. And they failed for two reasons. Number one, they tried to do it on their own. White people tried to colonize this vast landmass by themselves. They were unsuccessful, and they came over for purely economic reasons. The one attempt that succeeded was done by Puritans. They were fleeing religious persecution, and they came over because they wanted to be a city on a hill. They wanted a place where they could practice their religious liberty. And the reason why they succeeded, thanks to Pocahontas and not a few African Americans later down the road, is because the natives taught them how to produce crops here. And that first Thanksgiving was them surviving what would have been a really extreme winter, which would have killed them. So that's number one. Number two, there would be no American nation in the sense of an independent country if America did not have the economic wherewithal to challenge England, which was the most powerful empire on the earth at that time, were it not for some unpaid labor by those African slaves. So, for example, number one, they tried using white slaves. It didn't work because the white people could speak English and they could run away and then hop on a boat back to England, or they could just disappear. The natives could disappear into the forest. So, in order to clear forests and work the land, they absolutely had to rely upon those kidnapped Africans, because the Africans didn't speak the language and they could not get back across the Atlantic Ocean. Many of them had been taken from the interior of Africa. They were living in their own little communities. The whites hired other African kingdoms to kidnap them, force them out of the interior into the ocean. They had never seen the ocean.
Yes,
And
I'm going to
so,
have to just interject, because I know all this. And what I'm saying
right,
is that's the complex, and if there's anything that makes America unique, it's this history. What
yes,
I'm saying is, to be an American, if you ask me, close your eyes and imagine American, I'll probably think of a white guy. Would you see a black guy?
uh, an American, I would.
If someone said, "Close your eyes and think," and who do you see when you think, when I say the word American man? You close your eyes. To me, I'm seeing a cowboy and he's white. Who do you see?
I don't see one person. I just see a bunch of people who are like different.
Okay, well, that's a good answer too. Okay, and that's a perfectly valid answer, because that is what America became, and it became that. What I'm saying is, very early on, like there's even census data that shows that even in the 18th century, the so-called founding stock of the United States was already becoming like the minority, and it was already becoming the majority were new arrivals to this proposition, project, this country across the ocean. But my point is that that's the American identity. It's a bit fragile. It's a bit shallow. It's a kind of on paper identity. But the Irish identity is not that way. The Swedish identity is not that. The English identity, these are almost like biological realities as much as a lion is a lion and a tiger is a tiger and a kangaroo is a kangaroo.
Then why did they leave Ireland and leave Sweden and leave all those countries to come over
I
here?
don't care. I don't care. I literally don't care. What I'm saying is that their identity as a people is not determined by a piece of paper or an edict passed by the founding fathers. These are, if you look on their Wikipedia entries and you say, oh, the Irish people are a Northwest European ethnic group populating the island of Ireland. They have been living on the island since such and such BC. Like, you can't just say, oh, look, I've got an Irish passport, so now I'm Irish. I got a Swedish passport, so now I'm Swedish. These are real things.
Yeah,
just
but
like,
but
go ahead.
Angelo, identity wasn't enough, and that's why so many Irish people left Ireland, this homeland, and came here. It's because they knew they wouldn't be discriminated.
And what did they do? They went immediately to Irish or sort of Celtic enclaves. My Irish ancestors came to a part of America where they were still marrying with other Irish people. That's why my mother's Irish side, despite being in America since the late 19th century or about there, were still Irish. They were still looking for Irish community.
They were forced into those communities because the WASP establishment wouldn't accept them.
My Irish, where no one forced, they went there because they were miners back in Ireland. So they went to the mines in Michigan. They did what they were good at.
No, I know, but Angelo, there were no Irish signs on businesses, at schools, restaurants. The establishment created Irish ghettos and Jewish ghettos and black ghettos.
I'm not denying that there was anti-Irish.
It's not that they were like, oh, I can't wait to stay with my Irish. It was that they're like, look, we got to stick together until we can do better for ourselves. And that's why the Kennedy family is so important. And it's because they represent the moment at which the Irish had become a part of the establishment.
But I'm not going to let you get away with this notion, which I think you're trying to say, which is that people left their ethno-states because they were bad. So they went to the multiracial hodgepodge state because it was good. Irish fled the famine, which was imposed by British rule, it wasn't the Irish famine. This was not a result of Irish ethno-nationalism. It was a result of British imperialism.
Right.
They left because they were enticed over. They were like, literally, hey, you're miners, come work in our mines here in Michigan. And then when they did, they formed communities with fellow Irish people because that's who they liked being with, just like they did back home.
Were they better off as opposed to staying in Ireland? Were they better off in this new country?
In the long run, I don't know. I don't think anyone's been better off by being in America.
Tell that. Wait. Tell that to the Kennedys. Tell that to all of the Irish millionaires.
But I'm not looking at bank accounts and things like that.
I know, but
I think that being deracinated is bad.
They weren't deracinated. They immigrated. Deracinated sounds coercive. They weren't kicked out. They left on their own.
No, what I'm saying is that the deracination. So now, like, an Irish American is definitely distinct from an Irishman in Ireland.
Right. Okay. Because the ideological state is different. It's freer than the ethno state.
Right, but they still want to claim to, like, you see people, there's lots of Americans do, I'm Irish. I always say, I'm not Irish. I have Irish ancestry, but I would never, because I don't like it. I think these things matter. You can't just say, I had a great grandmother from Cork, so I'm Irish too. But you've never even been to Ireland, It's like, you don't get to say that. You don't get to call yourself. But a lot of people do because they want that sense of belonging to a people, and they realize that the American identity is a bit shallow. So they reach out to the place where they came from.
You can have that identity, but that's different from what you're talking about. You're trying to tell people what they are. I mean, but if they
No,
can't tell,
most people outside of the liberal West know who they are and are quite defensive of it. It's only
okay,
we who play these games.
I know,
And
but
that's what I was
you're
going back to earlier, is that when called upon, when faced with threats, I know my back's killing me too, man. We're gonna have to wrap this up soon. But when faced with threats, you know, you can say that wars have been fought for all sorts of shallow materialist reasons, and then they were just sort of given a veneer of jingoism or glory or conquest or whatever. In that sense, maybe it'll work to say we have to fight Russia because we are fighting for liberal democracy against Putin's fascist state. Okay, that might work. It might. But then, if you look at videos of man on the street videos in countries like England, where they say, the person with the microphone going around the street says to these young BAME citizens, hey, Keir Starmer says that we might have to go to war with Russia. Would you fight? Would you join the military? And they'll say, no, mate, I'd fuck off back to Jamaica. Or, really, I live here, but I'm not British, so I don't really have to fight for Britain. Because suddenly now, identity becomes this real, tangible thing.
that's not the
And the
reason.
world is this, nevertheless, in spite of all of the admirable desires you have, we still have to live in a world where there will be conflicts, and I'm not so sure that in the rest of the world, which is still very much blood and soil, I'm not so sure that our multiracial, multicultural societies are going to be up to the task when we can't unite on anything anymore.
It's not. Well, let me say this first of all. That people not wanting to fight in the war has nothing to do with ethnic identity, because I've spoken to Ukrainians who don't want to fight on behalf of the Ukrainian government to expel the Russians, and it has nothing to do with ethnic identity. They don't want to die, and they're not
Yes.
motivated by nationalistic sympathies like
Well, they're
this is our
actually
home.
they're really facing a clear and present possibility of dying. The
Yeah,
people I'm talking to, I'm not making this up. I can show you the videos of, and it's also just statistically true. Like this, military recruitment has gone down, desire to enlist has gone down, but there
everywhere.
are these videos of people being asked, would you fight for Britain? Would you join the British Army? And they all say, and again, these are non-white, migrant background citizens. They all say, "Are you joking? Of course not."
But
And it's because,
are you asking the white people the same question? Because I assume they'd
oh yeah,
probably
their
be
answers are also no, no,
there.
because, and they say it's because Britain's a colonialist, racist oppressor state, and they don't want to fight for it.
So I have a
They've been
question.
brainwashed into hating their own country.
So
So this is what I'm saying. In the paradigm that's been made by people like you, maybe with good intentions, or people like you, but with, in my opinion, not good intentions, they've created a world where people hate their nation state. They despise their ancestors. They are racked with guilt over things that they never did. They're told that they can't feel proud of their ancestors, but they are obliged to feel guilty about their ancestors' actions. And then you've also brought in populations of people from outside the native group who, they're like Schrodinger's European peoples. Catch them on a Monday and they'll say, I'm just as French as you, I'm just as Swedish as you, I'm just as Irish as you. And they'll say that because they want to benefit from the respective country and society that they've moved to. But if you catch them on a Tuesday, they'll say, hell no, I'm from Jamaica. And if ever there's a war and this country needs me, I'm popping off back to Jamaica or
everybody
Syria or Pakistan or wherever else. So
everybody does
with these
that.
conditions, how is Western civilization, Western countries, whatever you want to call it, or even your global state, which is being produced first in the petri dish of the West, how is it going to survive when faced with a China or a Russia who's not playing this game?
You have to be the change that you want to see in the world. With your mindset, I would love to see how you would function in the juvenile hall where when I go there during the summers, what would you do if you have this defeatist attitude and you're willing to let the forces of fragmentation and the forces of division defeat us because you said you're being a realist? What would you do in a situation where it is your job to make a difference? When I was getting my teaching credential, I had a conversation with my mentor teacher, my faculty advisor, that I will never forget. I was teaching a lesson, and there were kids who they were distracted, and she was marking me down, and she said, "Travanti, you didn't have enough engagement there." And I said, "You don't understand. These kids, their parents are like tweakers." I said, they have ADHD. They have backgrounds where there's no structure. She said, "Travanti, do you think I don't know this?" She said, "I supervise candidates all up and down the northern part of California." She says, "I see this all the time." She said, "It is your job to teach them in spite of all those setbacks. That's what you're being paid to do, not to make excuses for why it can't work." So if you really are troubled by the way in which migration is happening and cultural diversity is being implemented, it is a fact now, unless you're willing to resort to the tactics of Mr. National Socialist, Mr. A, or Uncle A, as you called him,
Not
hopefully
at
jokingly.
all. That's it. That is a joke. That is an
No,
in. To call him Uncle
no,
A is an in joke,
no,
but not at all.
well, then what are you
Because
planning
first
to
of all,
do?
I want to nip this in the bud because this is another curious thing. It goes back to the point that I was saying earlier about people are the creators of the culture or the philosophy or the art that you find inspiring or excellent. And if the same problems play out over and over again, no matter which country you implement the experiment, the American experiment, which I completely agree with that term, then there's something wrong with the variables in the experiment. And it's not either or there are fundamental differences in people groups, and you will get the same results no matter what. Now, I have no idea how I would address the situation that you described there, going to what I assume is mixed race, juvenile
Most,
detention center where
mostly
there's whites.
white,
Okay,
mostly
but mostly
white.
white. Okay. Yeah. Here's the thing. So, I mean, I don't know quite what the question is intended to provoke.
It doesn't.
I used to be a volunteer at homeless shelters all the time. I don't know. I've always had an affinity for like trying to help homeless people.
Can I
Um,
can I
yeah, go
clarify?
ahead.
Because
Go
I
ahead.
know you're trying to answer. Because you asked what is it trying to evoke? It's this. Because you're saying this is the situation, and what you're saying isn't reasonable. And I'm saying if you don't believe that you can make a difference and you don't work towards it, you will not make a difference. But if you do, if you come into it like me, who has a vision for what you want to accomplish and maybe the skill to do it and the heart to do it,
Hmm.
you can make a difference. I do it in my personal life. And you cannot tell me that progress has not been made in the United States when before we had millions of people enslaved and now they're free. All the lots have to you before we didn't have labor unions. Now we have things
Hmm.
like Social Security, a
Yeah.
work week, and a work day. Change has been
And I
made.
think that that's all worth upholding. And I think that in your case, it's misguided good intentions. In Larry Fink's case or Antifa's case, it's just bad intentions. But I think you really should take into consideration what I'm saying. My warning is the things that have been set up in the West, in a country like the United States, despite all of its injustices in the past and its chaotic sometimes and hard to figure out present, the fact that you do have things like labor unions and equal rights under law and and some of the things that you mentioned, classical music, and then also even the high tech society, the irrigation, 2-story and above buildings, all these things. I think it's worth maintaining all of that too. Now, my warning is you are actually putting this all at risk. There are growing numbers of people saying, "F this. We've messed up, and I don't like where we're going now." And they want to tear it all down. And they might have a point. It's like that T-shirt meme where it's like the evolution of apes to man, but then at the last stage, man sees like a, I don't know, like a troon or something. And he says, "Wait, go back. We messed up. Start the evolution all over again. We messed up here on this part of the T-shirt." Because it's becoming evident that some parts of culture are imbibable, are adoptable. You can adopt another culture, you can adopt wisdom, you can pursue classical wisdom, again, that comes from a specific people in a specific place and time. And you can adopt or develop a love for a type of music and things like that. But and again, it's just being played out in front of us. If you bring too many people from too different of places together too quickly, it all starts to fall apart. And you're going to lose the protection of equality under law, because now you have tribal factions bringing their third world warlike tribal cultures and fighting turf wars on the streets of Leeds or Luton Town or Malmo. The socialist utopia of Sweden, which was the model, everyone wanted to follow the Swedish model. And I don't mean just the ones walking down the catwalks on lingerie shows. I mean the economic model, the social model, the political model. The Nordic countries, like Sweden, were this shining example for liberals. It was the liberals who were most yearning, particularly in America, most yearning for something like the Swedish model. Sweden now is at risk of losing that all. If you didn't want the rise of the far right, you shouldn't have caused the conditions for the far right to rise in the first place.
One question, brother. You mentioned warlike tribalism. Who is responsible for killing more Europeans than any other person in history? Who did that?
I don't want to get in. It could be Napoleon, it could be Hitler. I don't care. I'm
Okay,
talking about the world we're living in now.
I know,
I'm
but
not
what
saying that Europeans aren't tribal, and I wish we were more warlike and tribal now. We've lost it. What I'm saying is we are importing people who are that way.
Russia just invaded Ukraine and disrupted their entire society because of war. And let me tell you something.
And Western Europeans have spent too much time sitting on sofas and being comfortable that they're not up to the task to fight invading Russians.
I think peace is but the same arguments you're making are exactly what was said about your actual ancestors, who were not the ancient Greeks and not the ancient. I know some Italians say, "Oh, we're descended from the Romans." Most of them are not, because the Romans were like a little tiny group, and there were all these other groups in Italy that had nothing to do with the empire. But what I'm telling you is this: the same arguments were made, and people were either looking back at the glories of Rome, or were looking forward to the glories of Christendom, and then eventually Western Europe, which emerged out of the ashes of that. So I want to give you a little metaphor. I'm going to say something very personal about my life that I hope people understand. A few years ago, I lost my mother. It was a terrible experience to cancer. And while I was grieving her and trying to understand how to exist without her, I found this book by a lady named Iyanla Vanzant. It was called Peace from Broken Pieces. And in that story, she relates her own experience with losing her daughter, Jamia, and how she was sort of staring into an abyss when the person that you love so much is no longer with you. And she related it to the story of the transport of Paul. Back in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a story of how Paul is being transported from Judea to Rome in order to stand trial before Caesar. And he gets a vision in the night by the arisen Christ, who says, "If you guys sail right now, your ship is going to be destroyed. But If you don't leave the ship, meaning don't abandon it, every single life on this ship will be spared. And so Paul tells this vision to the crew. They don't listen to him. They sail, and this storm comes in and it tears the boat to pieces. But what happens is that after the ship is blown apart, they are able to float on land from the broken pieces of the ship. And she said, God spoke to her and he told her, you can make it on your broken pieces. Make it on the pieces. You can't save the ship. The life that you've grown accustomed to, everything that you are used to is going away, and it's going away for very specific reasons. But you and everything that you care about can survive if you're willing to believe and make it on your broken pieces. Now, me being the classical scholar that I am, I thought of Rome, because Rome collapsed. It was a mighty ship that people had grown accustomed to. It was an eternal city, had been around for 1,000 years. And then all of a sudden it's been broken up and it's shattered, and there are all these little feudal polities that spring up after it. And you know what? The church was now in a position where they're like, we don't have the protection of the emperor anymore. We don't have the security of Roman roads and the infrastructure and all this stuff. And you know what they decided to do, Angelo? They made it on the broken pieces of that empire, and they were able to construct something more glorious and more powerful and more Christian than what they had left behind. So to me, that is the essence of progressivism. It recognizes that specific cultures, specific civilizations are protected and contained within an outer shell, an exterior. But what really matters is the nut, the kernel within them. The shell can be broken, but it can be transferred to an entirely new shell, an entirely new system, and it can actually achieve things that it never achieved prior to that. And so I recognize this system is falling apart. I think that the way that immigration is taking place is actually a symptom of the decay and not some strategic conspiracy. And even if it is, I recognize that the winds are against people who want to stem the tide. And so what I am choosing to do is believe that even if this whole world that you and I have grown up in collapses, I and people like myself, and even some people like you, can make it on the broken pieces of that system and flourish and thrive and do greater things than have ever been done before. So I'm choosing to walk in faith and not in skepticism and doubt.
Okay. And I'm going to let that be the last word. I could respond, but like I said earlier, I think we are having some back pains, and I'm sure we've been going for 4 hours now. I think it was like 2 hours ago that I said, I think we're going to start wrapping it up here. So 2 hours later, I think now would be a good point. And that was some very, very good final comments. Look, I think you have a really interesting worldview. I enjoyed talking to you a hell of a lot more than I've enjoyed talking to other people who share your worldview or similar parts of it. And I hope you've enjoyed talking to me. So again, let me put up your the email for your Sarugian Society. There's the email address there. Travanti, even the battery on my computer is going out. So we're going to wrap this up here. Thanks for coming on. Just briefly, do you have any final words or a farewell you want to say?
I just want to thank you for being willing to have this conversation, because I know a lot of people on your side don't. They don't want to talk to people who disagree with them. And I think that's so counterproductive. I believe in the marketplace of ideas. And so I appreciate you consenting to this.
All right. Well, I enjoyed it. I hope the listeners or the viewers enjoy this as well. And we'll wrap it up there. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.